The banging on the door came before sunrise, and Elena was already awake to hear it. She sat up on her narrow bed, heart pounding, listening to the heavy footsteps moving down the hallway of the house. She knew that walk. She knew the weight of it, the way it made the floorboards groan like they were afraid too. Marcus was awake, and Marcus was angry, and there was no reason for it yet, which was somehow worse than if there had been one. She pulled her knees to her chest and waited. The house belonged to Marcus, a senior enforcer of the Ashwood Pack, a man the entire territory admired. People spoke of him with respect in the market square. Children waved at him. The pack elders trusted him with difficult tasks because he never failed to complete them. To everyone outside these walls, Marcus was steady, capable, and honorable. Inside these walls, Elena knew a different man. She had learned, over the 6 years since her mother died, exactly how to read the sounds of the house. A slow step meant he was tired and might leave her alone. A fast step meant something had upset him at pack headquarters, and she should stay out of sight. This morning, the steps were fast and hard, and they were coming toward her door. She stood quickly, straightened the blanket on her bed, and smoothed down her nightclothes, as if being tidy might somehow protect her. It was a habit worn smooth by repetition, like a stone in a river. The door opened without a knock. Marcus stood in the frame, tall and broad-shouldered, still in the dark clothes he wore for early patrol. His eyes found her immediately, sweeping over the small room, the made bed, the closed window, as though searching for something to criticize. "You didn't finish your reports last night," he said. His voice was calm. That was the frightening part. He never needed to raise it. "I fell asleep," Elena said. "I was tired from training. I can finish them now, before." "You embarrassed me in front of Elder Simon," he said, cutting through her words like they hadn't been spoken at all. "He asked why my daughter's paperwork was incomplete. Do you understand what that does to how people see me?" She was not his daughter. She had never been his daughter. Her mother had married him when Elena was 9 years old, and when her mother died 2 years later, in a border skirmish, that the pack still spoke about in hushed voices, Marcus had become her guardian by default, the only adult with any legal claim to her. He reminded her constantly of the burden this was to him, of how generous he was being by keeping her at all, of how easily she could be sent away to a lesser pack, with no one to watch over her. "I'm sorry," Elena said, "because that was always the fastest way through these mornings. I'll fix it today, I promise." Marcus studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that made her want to disappear into the wall behind her. Then he simply nodded, as if she had passed some small test, and turned to leave. "Be at the training field by 7, he said over his shoulder. "Don't make me look foolish again." The door closed. Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. This was the pattern of her life. Not open cruelty that anyone could see and name, but 1,000 small cuts of control, timed and precise, always delivered where no one else could witness them. Marcus was careful. He was always careful. In public, his hand on her shoulder looked protective. In private, that same hand could tighten just enough to remind her who controlled her days. She dressed quickly in her training clothes, plain gray fabric that marked her as an ordinary pack member, with no particular rank or promise. She had once dreamed of becoming a healer, of learning the old remedies from the pack's elderly herbalist, Nora, who lived at the edge of the territory, in a cottage full of drying plants. Marcus had forbidden it 2 years ago, calling it a waste of time for someone with her limited talents. She had never asked again. Asking twice only made things worse. In the kitchen, she found a piece of bread and ate it standing at the counter, watching the gray light of early morning creep across the yard outside. The Ashwood territory stretched out beyond the window, forest and hills rolling toward a distant ridge where, it was said, you could see the border of the northern packs on a clear day. Elena had never traveled that far. Marcus did not allow unnecessary trips, and she had learned not to want things that required his permission. She thought, briefly, of her mother. Grace had been warm in a way that Elena sometimes struggled to remember clearly now, the details softening like an old photograph left in sunlight. She remembered laughter in this same kitchen, songs sung while cooking, a hand smoothing over her hair before bed. That house had felt different once. Now it felt like a place she was only allowed to exist in if she made no sound at all. She remembered, sometimes, how it had started. Not with anything dramatic. Not with a single moment she could point to and say, "This is when everything changed." It had started small, the way most difficult things do. A comment about her mother's cooking, that Marcus had insisted on doing differently after Grace died, as though even the kitchen needed correcting. A rule about which rooms Elena could enter without permission. A tone of voice that grew sharper each month, so gradually that by the time she noticed how much had shifted, she could no longer remember exactly when the shifting began. By the time she turned 13, she had stopped bringing friends home. By 14, she had stopped mentioning her day at dinner unless asked directly, having learned that unprompted conversation only gave Marcus more material to criticize. By 15, she had become fluent in a kind of silence that most people her age had never needed to learn, a careful, watchful quiet that let her move through her own home like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. She did not think of herself as unhappy, exactly. Unhappy felt like too large a word, too dramatic for what her life actually was. It was smaller than that. It was a constant, low-grade vigilance, a permanent awareness of where Marcus was in the house and what mood he carried with him. It was learning to read footsteps and door sounds and the particular way his jaw tightened before he spoke. It was survival dressed up as ordinary life, so thoroughly that most days Elena forgot there was any other way to exist. She had tried, once, to tell someone. She had been 16, and the school counselor at the PAC's shared learning hall had asked gentle questions about bruises Elena had explained away as training accidents. For one dizzying moment, sitting in that small office, Elena had considered telling the truth. But Marcus's reputation stretched wide across the territory, and the counselor had known him personally, had spoken warmly of his service to the PAC only days before. Elena had looked at that warmth and understood, with a clarity that still ached to remember, that no one would believe her over a man so widely respected. She had smiled instead, agreed the bruises were nothing, and never brought it up again. That was the lesson she carried now, 3 years later. Not that speaking up was wrong exactly, but that it required someone willing to listen past a reputation, someone who cared more about the truth than about comfortable assumptions. She had never met anyone like that. She had stopped expecting to. She left for the training field before Marcus could find another reason to be displeased. The field was already busy when she arrived, PAC members young and old going through drills under the pale morning sky. Elena took her place near the back, where she always stood, and began the familiar stretches. A voice beside her made her jump. "You look like you didn't sleep again." She turned to see Oliver, a young man a year older than her, with an easy smile and a habit of noticing things other people missed. He had been kind to her since childhood, one of the few people who treated her like a person instead of a shadow trailing behind Marcus's reputation. "I slept fine," Elena said, the lie coming out smooth and practiced. Oliver did not push. He rarely did, which was part of why she trusted him more than most. Instead, he fell into step beside her, as the trainer called out instructions. "My mother says the whole territory is talking about the royal visit," Oliver said quietly, as they moved through a set of paired drills. "Says it's the first time an Alpha King has come to Ashwood in her lifetime." "I heard something about it," Elena said, keeping her voice light. "You'll be at the welcome gathering, I suppose. Marcus will want you there, looking proper." Oliver said it without malice, simply stating a fact they both understood, but Elena still felt the familiar tightness in her chest at the reminder. "I suppose I will," she said. Oliver glanced at her, something careful in his expression. "You don't have to pretend with me, you know. I've known you since we were children. I notice things." "There's nothing to notice," Elena said, the words coming out faster than she intended, sharper than she meant them to be. "Elena, please," she said, quieter now. "Not here." Oliver studied her for a long moment, and she watched him decide, the way he always did, to let it go, rather than push her somewhere she clearly did not want to go. It was a kindness, in its way, though sometimes Elena wondered what would happen if someone simply refused to let it go, if someone pushed past her careful deflections and asked the question directly enough that she could not slip away from answering it. No one ever had. Not yet. "All right," Oliver said instead, returning his attention to the drill. "But if you ever want to talk, actually talk, you know where to find me." It was the second time that day someone had offered her exactly that, an open door, She had no intention of walking through. She thanked him quietly, and let herself think only about footwork and breathing for the rest of the hour, about the simple physical logic of movement, where the only thing that mattered was doing the next step correctly. It was the closest thing to peace she had. That peace ended the moment training concluded, and Marcus appeared at the edge of the field, arms crossed, watching. Elena felt the familiar tightening in her chest. Around her, other trainees waved to him respectfully, calling out greetings. He returned each one warmly, his public face sliding into place, as easily as breathing. "Elena," he called. "A word." She excused herself from Oliver, who gave her a look she couldn't quite read, something between concern and warning, and walked toward Marcus with her spine straight and her expression carefully blank. "There is a visitor coming to the territory," Marcus said, once they were far enough from the others. "Someone important. I expect you to behave appropriately. No embarrassments, no wandering off, no unnecessary conversations. Who is it?" Marcus's jaw tightened slightly, the way it did when he felt she had asked one question too many. "That is not your concern. Your concern is not humiliating me while he is here. Do you understand?"
"Yes," Elena said. "Good."
He looked at her a moment longer, something calculating behind his eyes, and then walked away without another word. Elena stood alone at the edge of the field, watching him go, and felt the small, familiar weight settle back over her shoulders. Whoever this visitor was, whatever his importance, she understood one thing clearly. It changed nothing about her life. Marcus's rules would remain the same. His control would remain the same. She had learned long ago not to hope for anything different. She did not yet know how wrong that assumption would prove to be. The rest of the day passed in its usual quiet rhythm. Elena finished the training reports Marcus had criticized her for, careful to make every line perfect, every signature exact. She delivered water to the elders' meeting hall when asked. She avoided unnecessary conversations, just as she had been told, though it was never hard to avoid conversations when most of the pack had learned, over the years, that Marcus's ward preferred to keep to herself. She had built that reputation carefully, a shield made of silence. In the evening, she walked the long path back toward the house Marcus kept at the edge of the residential district, a modest but well-respected home that matched his standing in the pack. The forest pressed close along both sides of the path, tall pines swaying gently in a breeze that smelled like rain. Elena liked this walk. It was one of the few times during the day when no one was watching her, when she could let her shoulders drop and breathe without calculating who might see. She heard the voices before she saw them. 2 pack guards standing near the crossroads, discussing something in low, urgent tones. King Dorian himself, they're saying, not just a representative. The Alpha King, coming here? To Ashwood? We haven't had a visit like that in a decade. Elena slowed her steps, curiosity pulling at her despite Marcus's warnings about unnecessary conversations. She was not speaking to them after all. She was only listening. Elder Simon says it's about the border treaty. Something about renewing old agreements before winter. But you know how these things go. The king doesn't travel for small matters. There's something else happening, mark my words. Well, whatever it is, half the pack is already in a panic, getting the guest house ready. My cousin says the king is younger than people expect. Fierce, though. Don't let the age fool you. Elena walked on before they noticed her listening, turning the information over in her mind. King Dorian, the Alpha King of the Northern Packs, ruler of a territory far larger and more powerful than Ashwood, a man whose name she had only ever heard mentioned in passing, in stories about pack politics that had nothing to do with her small, contained life. It was strange to think that such a person might soon walk the same paths she walked, breathe the same forest air, stand in the same meeting hall where she delivered water and stayed silent. She wondered, briefly, what kind of man he was. The guards had called him fierce. She imagined someone hard and unreadable, a man used to obedience, someone who would move through Ashwood for a few days and then vanish again, leaving her life exactly as unchanged as it had always been. She had no way of knowing, as she walked the last stretch of path toward the house where Marcus waited, that this visit would become the single most important event of her life. She had no way of knowing that somewhere beneath the practiced calm she wore like armor, a small crack had already begun to form, one that a stranger's careful eyes would soon find. On her way back from the crossroads, Elena took a small detour, one she rarely allowed herself, toward the cottage, at the edge of the territory, where Nora the healer lived among her drying herbs and quiet, watchful eyes. She told herself she only wanted to ask about a headache that had bothered her for days. A small, harmless reason that would not draw Marcus's attention if anyone happened to mention it. Nora was outside when Elena arrived, hanging bundles of lavender along a wooden rail to dry in the evening air. She was an older woman, silver-haired and slow-moving, but her eyes were sharp in a way that made Elena feel, every time she visited, as though the woman could see straight through whatever calm expression she wore. "Elena," Nora said, not looking surprised at all. "It has been a while." "I know. I'm sorry. Marcus keeps me busy." "I imagine he does." Something flickered across Nora's face, gone before Elena could name it. "Come, sit. Tell me what brought you." Elena sat on the small bench near the cottage door and explained the headache, watching as Nora moved efficiently around her, gathering leaves and roots into a small paper packet. It was easy to talk to Nora. The old woman never pushed, never demanded explanations for things Elena did not want to explain, and there was a comfort in that Elena had come to depend on more than she liked to admit. "You are tired," Nora said eventually, handing over the packet. "Not just today. For a long while now." "I'm fine," Elena said automatically. Nora studied her for a moment, the same searching look she always gave, and then let the subject go, the way she always did. "There is talk of a royal visit," she said instead, changing direction with the ease of someone who understood exactly how far she was allowed to push. "The Alpha King himself, they say. I heard. Marcus wants the house prepared." "Of course he does." Nora's tone carried something dry and knowing, an opinion of Marcus she never stated outright, but that Elena had learned to recognize over the years. "Kings see things other people miss, Elena. Sometimes that is a comfort. Sometimes it is not." Elena did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, only thanked Nora for the herbs and rose to leave. At the edge of the yard, the old woman called after her. "If you ever need somewhere quiet," Nora said, "you know where to find me." It was an offer Elena had heard variations of before, gentle and open-ended, never pushing too hard against the walls Elena had built around her own life. She nodded, said she would remember, and continued down the path toward home, the packet of herbs tucked carefully into her pocket, Nora's words settling somewhere she could not quite reach to examine them. She thought about them anyway, the whole rest of the walk home. Kings see things other people miss. She wondered, not for the first time, what exactly Nora suspected about the house Elena lived in, about the careful, practiced way Elena moved through her days. The old woman had never asked directly. Elena had never offered. It was a silence that had held for years, comfortable in its own strange way, safer than the alternative. But something about the coming visit made that silence feel different tonight, heavier, somehow, as if it were a held breath about to be released, whether Elena wanted it to be or not. That night, dinner was tense in the way it always was when Marcus had something on his mind. He spoke little, his attention somewhere else entirely, and Elena ate quickly and quietly, eager to retreat to her room before his mood could shift toward her. She almost made it. "The king's visit," Marcus said suddenly, as she stood to clear her plate, "will require the household to be presentable. You will help prepare the guest quarters tomorrow, and you will not speak unless spoken to. Is that understood?" "Yes," Elena said. "I mean it, Elena." His voice dropped, quieter now, which was somehow more unsettling than if he had shouted. "Whatever you think you know about your place in this house, whatever complaints you might imagine you have, you will keep them to yourself while he is here. A king's visit is not the time for you to embarrass this family with your usual sulking." She had not been planning to say anything at all. She never did. But something in the way he said it, the assumption that she was constantly on the verge of some rebellion she had never once attempted, made something small and tired flicker behind her ribs. "I understand," she said instead, because that was safer than anything else she might have said. Marcus nodded, satisfied, and returned to his meal. Elena carried her plate to the kitchen, washed it in silence, and climbed the stairs to her room, where she sat by the window and looked out at the darkening forest, thinking about kings and control, and the strange, small hope that had no business existing in a life like hers, the hope that maybe, just maybe, something was about to change. She did not sleep well that night, she rarely did. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, it was not entirely fear keeping her awake. It was something else, something she did not yet have a name for, a feeling that sat quietly beneath her ribs like a held breath, waiting to see what the morning would bring. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, carrying the scent of rain toward a territory that had no idea how much was about to change. Somewhere beyond the ridge, in a convoy moving steadily south, King Dorian traveled toward Ashwood with his own reasons for the visit, reasons that had little to do with the treaty everyone assumed, and everything to do with instincts he had learned never to ignore. Neither of them knew yet that their paths were about to cross. Neither of them knew how much would unravel because of it. But the forest seemed to know. It always did. The guest house had never looked so polished. Elena spent the entire morning on her knees, scrubbing floors that were already clean, arranging flowers that Marcus rearranged the moment he saw them, and folding linens according to a standard so exact that she had redone the same stack 4 times before he finally nodded his approval. Around her, other members of the household staff moved with the same nervous energy, everyone aware that the eyes of the Alpha King would soon pass over their work. "Faster," Marcus said, appearing in the doorway for the 3rd time that hour. The convoy was spotted at the northern gate. "They will arrive within the hour." Elena straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "The linens are finished. Should I?" "Just stay out of the way," Marcus said, already turning to bark instructions at someone else. "And remember what I told you. No unnecessary conversations. No embarrassments." "I remember," Elena said to his retreating back. She retreated to the kitchen, where she could be useful without being visible, and busied herself preparing trays of refreshments that would likely never be touched by anyone as important as a king. Through the window, she could hear the distant sound of horns, the signal that the royal convoy had passed the outer boundary of the territory. The whole household seemed to hold its breath at once. By the time Elena finished the trays, the front of the house had filled with pack elders and senior members, all arranged in careful rows to greet the arriving party. She positioned herself at the back, half hidden behind a pillar, exactly where Marcus preferred her to be during important occasions, present enough to prove he had a family, invisible enough to cause no trouble. The convoy arrived with quiet efficiency rather than fanfare, a dozen mounted guards flanking a simple black carriage that stopped precisely in front of the gathered elders. Elena watched, curious despite herself, as the carriage door opened and a man stepped down onto the packed earth of the courtyard. She had expected, from the way people spoke of him, someone older, someone who wore his power like a heavy crown, visible and demanding. Instead, King Dorian looked younger than she anticipated, perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair and an economy of movement that suggested strength held carefully in reserve, rather than displayed for effect. He wore simple, well-made clothes rather than elaborate royal dress, and his eyes moved across the gathered crowd with an alertness that felt entirely different from the polite, distracted attention most visiting dignitaries offered. Elder Simon stepped forward to greet him, with the formal words Ashwood had prepared for weeks, and Dorian responded with brief, courteous replies that carried none of the empty flattery Elena had expected from someone of his rank. He seemed, if anything, faintly impatient with the ceremony, his attention drifting periodically toward the edges of the gathered crowd, as though searching for something the formal greetings could not provide. Marcus stepped forward at his designated moment, offering a deep, practiced bow. "Your Majesty, Ashwood is honored by your presence. I am Marcus, senior enforcer of this territory, and I hope our hospitality meets your expectations." "I'm sure it will," Dorian said, his tone polite but distant, the words of a man who had heard 1,000 similar greetings and found them all equally forgettable. Elena watched from behind her pillar, expecting the exchange to end there, expecting the king to move on to the next elder in line, as protocol demanded. Instead, something made him pause. His gaze swept the crowd once more, slower this time, and for a fraction of a second, it landed directly on her. Elena froze. She had done nothing to draw attention to herself. She had stayed exactly where Marcus instructed, half hidden, perfectly still. And yet the king's eyes had found her anyway, holding for just a moment longer than seemed natural, before moving on to the next introduction. She told herself it meant nothing. Kings looked at crowds. It was only natural that his gaze would pass over everyone present, including her. But something about the way he had looked at her, brief as it was, left an odd, unsettled feeling in her chest, as though she had been seen in a way she was not accustomed to being seen. The formal greetings continued for another 20 minutes, a slow procession of introductions and pleasantries that Elena only half listened to from her place at the back. When it finally concluded, the elders led Dorian and his small entourage toward the guest house for refreshments, and the crowd began to disperse into smaller conversations, the tension of the arrival finally easing. Elena slipped back toward the kitchen, grateful for a reason to disappear, and spent the next hour refilling trays and carrying dishes, careful to remain in the background wherever the king's group was gathered. She caught glimpses of him occasionally through doorways, listening politely to Elder Simon's lengthy explanations of border logistics, nodding at appropriate intervals, his expression pleasant but unreadable. It was late afternoon when Marcus found her in the kitchen, his expression carrying the particular tightness that meant he had noticed something displeasing. "The king asked about you," he said, without preamble. Elena's hands stilled on the tray she was carrying. "About me?" "He asked who you were. I told him you were my ward, nothing more. A quiet girl who keeps to herself." Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. "I don't know what you did to draw his attention, but I expect you to correct it. Stay further back. Do not make eye contact. Do you understand?" "I didn't do anything," Elena said, honestly bewildered. "I was standing exactly where you told me to stand." "Then make yourself less visible," Marcus said, his voice dropping into the quiet register that always preceded worse things. "I will not have you causing complications during this visit. This is important, Elena. More important than you understand. Do not embarrass me." "I won't," Elena said quickly, before his mood could sharpen further. "I promise." Marcus studied her for a moment longer, then seemed to decide the warning had landed sufficiently, and left without another word. Elena stood alone in the kitchen, her heart still beating slightly too fast, turning the strange interaction over in her mind. She had done nothing. She had followed every instruction exactly, and yet somehow, simply existing in the king's line of sight, had become another thing she needed to apologize for. She thought again of the moment his eyes had found hers across the courtyard, that brief pause before he moved on. She told herself it had been nothing, a king's gaze passing over a crowd, meaning no more than that. But some small, quiet part of her, a part she rarely let herself listen to, wondered if it had been something else entirely. The evening brought a formal dinner in the PAC's largest meeting hall, an occasion Elena was required to attend but not permitted to enjoy. She sat at a lower table, with other household staff and minor PAC members, far from the elevated table where Marcus sat near Elder Simon and the visiting king, and spent most of the meal quietly watching the room, careful to keep her expression neutral no matter what she observed. What she observed, more than once, was Dorian's gaze drifting toward her table. It happened 3 times over the course of the meal, brief glances that lasted no longer than a second or two before he returned his attention to whatever conversation occupied him. Elena told herself each time that she was imagining it, that a king, surrounded by an entire hall of people, had no particular reason to notice her among so many others. But by the 3rd time, she could no longer convince herself it was simple coincidence. She kept her eyes carefully on her plate for the remainder of the meal, unwilling to test whether meeting his gaze directly would make the strange, watched feeling in her chest better or worse. When the dinner finally concluded and guests began to disperse, she rose quickly, eager to escape to the relative safety of her own room, before Marcus could find another reason to criticize her. She almost made it out of the hall unnoticed. "Excuse me." The voice was calm, pleasant, and entirely unfamiliar in its directness. Elena turned and found herself face to face with King Dorian himself, standing only a few steps away, close enough that she had to fight the instinct to immediately look at the ground. "Your Majesty," she said quickly, dropping into the small, formal bow expected of someone her rank. "Is there something you need?" "Only your name," Dorian said. No one seemed inclined to offer it earlier. Elena hesitated, aware of Marcus somewhere nearby, aware of how badly this moment could go if handled wrong. "Elena," she said finally, "I'm the ward of Marcus, the senior enforcer. So I was told." Something in Dorian's tone suggested he found the description slightly insufficient, though he did not elaborate. His eyes, dark and steady, studied her with an attention that felt entirely different from the polite disinterest she was accustomed to receiving from important visitors. "You were at the welcome gathering this morning." "Yes, Your Majesty." "You seemed uncomfortable there." "More than the occasion should have called for." He said it simply, without accusation, but the observation landed somewhere deep in Elena's chest, somewhere she had thought was well protected. "I'm not accustomed to such important occasions," Elena said carefully. That's all it was. Dorian looked at her for a long moment, and Elena had the distinct, unsettling impression that he did not entirely believe her, though he did not push the point. "Of course," he said instead. "Thank you for your name, Elena. I hope the rest of your evening is pleasant." He turned and walked away before she could respond, rejoining a conversation with Elder Simon near the elevated table, leaving Elena standing alone near the hall's entrance, her heart beating strangely fast, for reasons she could not fully explain. She made her way home in the darkening evening, the strange encounter replaying in her mind with an insistence she couldn't quite dismiss. No one had ever looked at her the way Dorian had looked at her, that brief, direct attention that seemed to see past the careful blankness she had spent years perfecting. It frightened her, a little. It also, in some small and unfamiliar way, felt like being noticed for the first time in longer than she could remember. Back at the house, Marcus was waiting in the front room when she arrived, his expression unreadable in a way that immediately put her on alert. "You spoke with him," he said, not a question. Elena's stomach dropped. "He approached me. I only gave him my name, as courtesy required." "What else did he ask?" "Nothing important. He asked why I seemed uncomfortable at the gathering this morning. I told him I wasn't used to important occasions." She kept her voice even, careful not to let any of the strange, unsettled feeling from the encounter show through. Marcus studied her for a long moment, and Elena forced herself to hold his gaze, knowing that looking away too quickly would only invite further suspicion. Finally, he seemed to accept her account, though the tightness around his eyes did not fully disappear. "Kings notice things," Marcus said, echoing, without knowing it, the same words Nora had offered the day before. Sometimes idle curiosity, sometimes something more calculated. "Either way, I want you to give him no further reason to notice you. Stay in the kitchen tomorrow. Stay away from the formal gatherings entirely, if you can manage it." "For how long is he staying?" Elena asked, immediately regretting the question when Marcus's eyes sharpened. "Long enough," he said, which told her nothing at all. "Go to bed. Tomorrow will be busy." Elena climbed the stairs to her room, her mind still turning over the strange day, the way it had begun with the usual dread of Marcus's early morning temper, and ended with a conversation she still couldn't quite categorize. She sat by her window for a long while, looking out at the dark shapes of the trees, thinking about the king's steady gaze, and the odd, careful way he had asked his questions, as though genuinely curious about her answers, rather than simply making polite conversation. She thought too about Marcus's reaction, the particular flavor of his anxiety that felt different from his usual displeasure. He was not merely annoyed that she had drawn attention. He seemed, if she examined it honestly, almost afraid of what that attention might uncover. It was a strange thought, one she turned over carefully in the dark, unable to quite decide what to make of it. Sleep came slowly that night, interrupted by half-formed thoughts of dark, steady eyes finding hers across a crowded room, and the odd, unfamiliar sensation of being truly seen. She told herself, as she finally drifted off, that it meant nothing, that the king would finish his business in Ashwood within a few days, and depart, leaving her life to return to its familiar, careful rhythm. She was wrong, though she would not understand exactly how wrong for several more days yet. The following morning, true to Marcus's instructions, Elena kept to the kitchen, busying herself with tasks that required no interaction with the visiting party. She heard, secondhand, through the chatter of other household staff, that the king had spent the morning in meetings with Elder Simon and the senior pack council, discussing the border treaty that had officially brought him to Ashwood in the first place. It was exactly the kind of ordinary diplomatic business that should have consumed the entirety of his visit, uneventful and unremarkable. And yet, twice that day, Elena caught sight of him in places that seemed slightly outside the expected path of formal meetings, once near the training field where she had exercised the previous morning, and once along the very path she walked each evening on her way home. Both times, their eyes met only briefly, before duty or distance pulled them apart again. But both times, Elena found herself wondering whether the encounters were truly as accidental as they appeared. She said nothing of these observations to anyone. Not to Marcus, who would only tighten his restrictions further. Not to Oliver, who would ask questions she did not know how to answer. She carried the strange, quiet wondering alone, the way she carried most things, and waited to see what the following days of the king's visit might reveal. The forest path was empty when Elena stepped onto it, or so she believed, until a familiar voice spoke from among the trees. "You walk this route every evening." Elena startled, turning to find King Dorian standing a short distance off the path, half shadowed by the low branches of a pine tree, dressed simply enough that if she hadn't already known his face, she might have mistaken him for any other traveler passing through the territory. "Your Majesty," she said, dropping into a quick bow, her heart suddenly racing. "I didn't expect. Forgive me. I should announce myself properly. There's no need for that out here," Dorian said, stepping onto the path beside her with an ease that suggested he had done this deliberately, waited for her specifically, rather than encountering her by chance. "I only meant that I've noticed you walking this way each evening. It seemed a peaceful route." "It is," Elena said carefully, unsure what to make of this, unsure whether admitting anything honest about her preferences might somehow be used against her later. "It's quiet. You value quiet." It wasn't quite a question, but something in his tone invited a response anyway. "Most people do, I think." "Most people don't need it the way you seem to," Dorian said, and Elena felt the observation land somewhere she wasn't prepared for. Too close to true things she preferred to keep buried. "I should get home," she said instead of answering. "Marcus will be expecting me." Something flickered across Dorian's expression at the mention of Marcus's name, gone too quickly for Elena to read clearly. "Of course," he said, "I won't keep you. Though I hope you don't mind if I walk part of the way. I find myself curious about this territory, and you seem to know its paths well." It was not a request Elena felt equipped to refuse, not from a king, and so she found herself walking beside him along the familiar route, acutely aware of every step, every silence, every small exchange that felt more significant than it should have. "Tell me about Ashwood," Dorian said after a moment. "Not the official version Elder Simon gave me this morning. The real one." "I'm not sure there's much difference," Elena said. "It's a good pack. People work hard. The elders are fair mostly." "Mostly," Dorian repeated, catching the small qualifier immediately. "What falls outside of mostly?" Elena hesitated, aware she had said more than she intended. "Nothing important. Every pack has small disagreements. Ashwood is no different." "I imagine that's true everywhere," Dorian said, though his tone suggested he had noticed her retreat, and chosen, for now, not to push against it. "Tell me something else then. What do you do here? Beyond assisting your guardian, I mean." "I train, mostly. Basic combat and defense work, the same as everyone my age." "Is that what you want to do?" The question caught her off guard, simple as it was. No one had asked Elena what she wanted in longer than she could remember. "It doesn't matter what I want," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "It's what's practical." "Those aren't always the same thing," Dorian said quietly. "But I suspect you already know that." Elena glanced at him, surprised by the gentleness in his tone, so different from the careful, distant courtesy she had expected from someone of his position. "I used to want to study healing," she admitted, unsure why she was telling him this at all. "With Nora, the healer here, it didn't work out." "Why not?" "It wasn't considered a good use of my time." Dorian was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something careful, deliberate. "Who decided that?" Elena felt the question like a small trap closing, though she suspected Dorian hadn't meant it that way. "It doesn't matter," she said again, faster this time. "It was a long time ago. I've made peace with it." They walked in silence for several more minutes, the forest around them settling into the deep blue shadows of early evening. Elena could feel Dorian's attention on her, patient and unhurried, and found herself both unsettled and strangely comforted by it, an odd combination she had no experience navigating. "May I ask you something direct?" Dorian said eventually, as the lights of the residential district became visible through the trees ahead. "You're the king," Elena said. "I don't think I'm in a position to refuse." You could refuse, Dorian said. I would still ask, but you could refuse to answer. Something about the distinction, small as it was, caught Elena off guard. No one had ever framed a question to her that way, as though her refusal genuinely mattered rather than being merely tolerated. All right, she said, ask. Are you happy here? The question hung in the air between them, simple and enormous all at once. Elena felt her carefully practiced composure waver, just slightly, at the directness of it. I don't understand the question, she said, buying time. I think you do, Dorian said, not unkindly. I've watched you for 2 days now, Elena. I've seen how you hold yourself when Marcus is nearby, and how differently you hold yourself when he isn't. I've seen you flinch at sudden movements that shouldn't warrant flinching. I'm not asking to embarrass you. I'm asking because something tells me the honest answer to that question is not the one you're about to give me. Elena's chest tightened, panic rising sharp and immediate. I don't know what you think you've seen, she said, her voice tighter than she intended. But I promise you, everything is fine. Marcus has taken good care of me since my mother passed. I owe him everything. That's not an answer to my question, Dorian said gently. It's the only answer I have, Elena said, and there was something almost pleading in her voice now, an unspoken request for him to let the subject drop before it went somewhere she couldn't control. Dorian studied her for a long moment, and Elena watched him decide, much as Oliver had decided before him, to let the subject rest rather than push it further tonight. But unlike Oliver, something in his expression suggested this was not the end of the conversation, only a pause in it. All right, he said quietly. I won't press you further tonight. But I want you to know something, Elena, and I want you to remember it, whether or not you believe it yet. I notice things. It is, unfortunately for the people who prefer I didn't, one of my more persistent qualities. And I intend to keep noticing, for as long as I remain in Ashwood. They had reached the edge of the residential district now, close enough to Marcus's house that continuing the conversation felt suddenly dangerous. Elena stopped walking, and Dorian stopped beside her, understanding without being told that this was where their paths needed to separate. Thank you for walking with me, Your Majesty, she said, falling back into the formal distance that felt safer than anything they had just discussed. Dorian, he said, when we're not standing in front of an audience, you may call me Dorian. I don't think that would be appropriate, Elena said. Perhaps not, Dorian agreed, something almost like a smile touching the corner of his mouth. Good evening, Elena. I hope you sleep well. He turned and walked back the way they had come, leaving Elena standing alone at the edge of the path, her heart pounding, with an unfamiliar combination of fear and something else, something warmer and far more dangerous to examine closely. She stood there for a long moment, before finally continuing home, replaying every word of the conversation, wondering how much he had truly seen, and how much longer she could keep the rest of it hidden. Marcus was waiting when she arrived, his expression immediately sharpening at how late she was. Where have you been? The walk took longer than usual, Elena said. I'm sorry. Marcus's eyes narrowed, studying her face with the particular scrutiny he reserved, for moments when he suspected he was not receiving the full truth. You saw him, didn't you, the king? Elena's mouth went dry. He was walking the same path. We spoke briefly. Nothing important. What did he ask you? About the territory. About Ashwood. Nothing about. She stopped herself before finishing the thought, aware of how dangerous it would be to even suggest what Dorian had actually asked. Nothing about what? Marcus's voice had gone very quiet, very still, the tone that frightened Elena more than any shout could have. Nothing, she said quickly. Just idle conversation. I told him nothing worth mentioning. Marcus watched her for a long, tense moment, and Elena held perfectly still, willing herself not to give anything away. Finally, something in his expression eased, though the wariness remained underneath it, banked but not extinguished. You will avoid him for the remainder of his visit, Marcus said. If he approaches you again, you will excuse yourself immediately. I don't care how it looks. Do you understand me? Yes, Elena said. I mean it, Elena. This is not a request. His hand closed around her upper arm, not hard enough to leave a mark, but firm enough to make the warning unmistakable. Whatever game you think you're playing, whatever attention you think you want, you will end it. Tonight. Do you understand? I'm not playing any game, Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. I promise, I'll avoid him. I understand. Marcus held her gaze a moment longer, before releasing her arm and stepping back, his composure sliding back into place, as easily as it always did. Good, he said. Go to bed. Elena climbed the stairs on unsteady legs, closing her door behind her, before allowing herself to finally exhale, the tension of the evening finally breaking loose in a way that left her shaking slightly as she sat on the edge of her bed. She thought of Dorian's words, patient and direct, so unlike anything she was accustomed to receiving from anyone in her life. I notice things. I intend to keep noticing. She did not know whether to feel grateful or terrified. Perhaps, she thought, staring at the ceiling long after she should have been asleep, it was reasonable to feel both at once. The next 2 days passed in careful avoidance, exactly as Marcus had instructed. Elena kept to the kitchen during official gatherings, took a different path home each evening to avoid any accidental encounters, and spoke to no one about the strange, unsettling conversation that continued to replay itself in her mind at unexpected moments throughout each day. She told herself this was for the best, that whatever Dorian had noticed, whatever he suspected, it was safer for everyone if he simply finished his business in Ashwood and returned north without further complication. But avoidance, she was slowly beginning to understand, was not the same thing as forgetting. And somewhere beneath her careful compliance with Marcus's instructions, a small, persistent voice had begun asking a question she had spent years training herself not to ask. What if someone finally believed her? She was not the only one turning the encounter over in her mind. That same night, in the guest house set aside for the royal party, Dorian sat by the window of his temporary quarters, his advisor Charlotte seated across from him with a small stack of correspondence she had been trying, without much success, to get him to review. You've read that same letter 3 times, without responding to a word of it, Charlotte said, setting down her own papers. Something is distracting you. There's a girl here, Dorian said, without preamble. Marcus's ward, Elena. Charlotte raised an eyebrow, familiar enough with her king to recognize when a comment carried more weight than its brevity suggested. The quiet one from the welcome gathering. I noticed you looking for her more than once. I don't think she's simply quiet, Dorian said. I think she's frightened. Consistently, carefully frightened, in a way that suggests practice rather than a single bad day. Frightened of what? I don't know yet, but every time Marcus is nearby, something changes in her. Her shoulders draw in. Her eyes go careful in a specific way I've seen before, in soldiers who've survived things they don't discuss. Dorian's jaw tightened slightly, and when I asked her directly whether she was happy here, she nearly convinced herself to lie to me before I could see it happen. Charlotte was quiet for a moment, considering this. Marcus has an excellent reputation. Elder Simon speaks of him as one of the finest enforcers Ashwood has produced in a generation. I'm aware, Dorian said, which is precisely why I intend to be careful about this. A man with that kind of reputation does not become vulnerable to accusation easily, especially accusations from a young ward with no rank and no voice on the pack council. If I move too quickly, or too clumsily, I could make her situation considerably worse rather than better. You've decided there is a situation then, Charlotte said, based on flinching and careful eyes. I've decided it's worth investigating properly, Dorian corrected, quietly, and without alerting Marcus that anyone suspects anything at all. I want you to speak with the household staff tomorrow. Discreetly, see what people say about the girl, about her guardian, about the house itself. People often reveal more in casual conversation than they realize. Charlotte studied him for a long moment. You care about this a great deal, for someone you've known for 2 days. I care about it because instinct rarely lies to me, and my instincts have been shouting since the moment I saw her standing half-hidden behind that pillar at the welcome gathering, trying so hard to disappear that it became the very thing that made me notice her. Dorian's voice had gone quiet, thoughtful. An alpha's duty extends beyond treaties and borders, Charlotte. If something is wrong in this pack, if someone in a position of trust is causing harm behind closed doors, that concerns me every bit as much as the border agreement I came here to negotiate. And if you're wrong, if this is simply a shy girl who's had a difficult few years since losing her mother, and nothing more sinister than that, then I will have asked a few careful questions and caused no harm in the process, Dorian said. But if I'm right, and I do nothing, I will have looked directly at someone's suffering and chosen to look away, because it was politically inconvenient to notice. That is not the kind of alpha I intend to be. Charlotte nodded slowly, some of her earlier skepticism giving way to the particular respect she reserved for the moments when Dorian's instincts, sharp and unglamorous as they often were, proved themselves worth following. I'll speak with the staff tomorrow, she said, carefully, as you asked. Thank you. Dorian returned his attention to the window, to the dark shape of the forest beyond the guest house, thinking of the path Elena walked each evening, and the careful, guarded way she had finally admitted, however briefly, to a dream she had been forced to abandon. It doesn't matter what I want, she had said, as though the very idea of her own preferences mattering was a foreign concept. He intended to find out exactly why that was, no matter how many careful, patient conversations it required. The following morning, Charlotte moved through her assigned task with practiced subtlety, striking up conversations with various members of the household staff, under the guise of gathering information for the royal party's comfort. Most conversations yielded little beyond polite, unremarkable answers, but a pattern began to emerge nonetheless, one built more from careful omission than direct statement. No one spoke ill of Marcus, not once, not even under Charlotte's gentle prompting. But several staff members grew visibly uncomfortable when Elena's name arose, offering brief, guarded responses before quickly changing the subject. One older woman, tasked with managing the household linens, mentioned in passing that Elena seemed a serious sort of girl, always working, never much time for anything else, in a tone that suggested this observation carried more weight than the words themselves conveyed. It was Oliver, encountered by chance near the training field, who offered the most useful information, though even he chose his words with visible care. She's had a difficult few years, Oliver said, when Charlotte mentioned, carefully, that the royal party had noticed Elena's reserved manner. Since her mother passed, Marcus does his best, I'm sure, but, he trailed off, clearly reconsidering whatever he had been about to say. But, Charlotte prompted gently. Oliver hesitated, glancing around as though checking for anyone who might overhear. I've known Elena since we were children. She used to be different, lighter, somehow. These past few years, she's grown so quiet, so careful about everything she says and does. I've asked her about it more than once. She always tells me everything is fine. His expression suggested he did not fully believe this, though loyalty or fear kept him from saying so outright. I don't know what happens in that house. I only know she's not the same person she used to be. Charlotte thanked him for his time, and returned to report her findings to Dorian, who listened with the same careful attention he brought to matters of genuine consequence, filing away every small, uncertain detail into a picture that was slowly, steadily beginning to take a shape neither of them liked. It's not proof of anything, Charlotte said, once she had finished. Nothing anyone said constitutes a direct accusation. No, Dorian agreed, but it's a pattern. And patterns, in my experience, rarely form around nothing. His expression had hardened into something quiet and resolute. I intend to speak with Elena again, somewhere private enough that she might finally feel safe telling me the truth. And if Marcus interferes, then I will deal with Marcus, Dorian said, in whatever manner the situation requires. The summons came the next morning, delivered by a royal guard who found Elena in the kitchen and informed her, with careful formality, that King Dorian requested her presence in the guest house gardens at midday. Elena's stomach dropped immediately. Did he say why? Only that it concerned matters of the border territory, the guard said, though something in his tone suggested even he did not fully believe this explanation. He asked that you come alone. She knew, the moment she heard the word alone, that this had nothing to do with border territories. She spent the remainder of the morning in a state of quiet dread, torn between the fear of what Dorian might ask and the smaller, more dangerous fear of what she might finally say if he asked it the right way. Marcus intercepted her before she could leave for the meeting, his expression carrying the particular stillness that always preceded his sharpest warnings. The king requested you specifically, he said. Why? I don't know, Elena said honestly. The guard said it concerned the border territory. Perhaps he wants information about the eastern paths, since I walk them often. Marcus studied her, clearly unsatisfied with this explanation, but unable to immediately identify a better one. You will answer whatever he asks about the territory, he said finally. Nothing more. If he asks anything about this household, about our arrangement, about anything personal, you will tell him it is not appropriate for you to discuss such matters. Do you understand? Yes, Elena said. I mean it, Elena. His hand found her shoulder, gripping just hard enough to make his meaning unmistakable. If you say anything that embarrasses this family, anything at all, there will be consequences. Do we understand each other? We understand each other, Elena said quietly, and Marcus finally released her, apparently satisfied enough to let her go. The guest house gardens were quiet when Elena arrived, a small, carefully maintained space of flowering shrubs and stone paths that Ashwood's household staff had spent the morning tending in preparation for the royal visit. Dorian was already there, seated on a stone bench near a small fountain, and rose when he saw her approaching. Thank you for coming, he said. I hope Marcus didn't give you too much trouble about it. He wants to know why you asked for me specifically, Elena said. Deciding honesty about this much at least carried little risk. What did you tell him? That it probably concerned the border territory, since I walk the eastern paths often. Something like amusement flickered across Dorian's face. A reasonable guess, though not accurate, as I suspect you already know. Elena said nothing, waiting, her hands clasped carefully in front of her, in the posture she had perfected over years of standing before people who held power over her life. Please, sit, Dorian said, gesturing to the bench beside him. When she hesitated, he added, more gently, I promise this isn't a trap, Elena. I only want to talk. Somewhere Marcus can't overhear. Somewhere you might feel able to speak more freely than you have so far. She sat, carefully, at the far end of the bench, maintaining as much distance as the space allowed. I don't know what you want me to say, she said. I've told you the truth. Marcus takes care of me. I have no complaints. You've told me what you believe is safe to say, Dorian corrected gently. That isn't quite the same thing as the truth, and I think you know that as well as I do. Elena's jaw tightened. With respect, Your Majesty, you've known me for 3 days. You don't know what is or isn't true about my life. You're right, Dorian said, surprising her with the easy admission. I don't know the specifics. I only know what I've observed, and what I've observed troubles me enough that I felt obligated to ask directly, rather than simply returning north and pretending I noticed nothing at all. What exactly have you observed? Elena asked, unable to keep a small defensive edge from creeping into her voice. I've observed a young woman who flinches at sudden movement, who watches doorways the way soldiers watch enemy lines, who has trained herself so thoroughly in careful blankness that maintaining it has become instinct rather than choice. I've observed a guardian who speaks warmly of you in public and grips your arm hard enough to leave finger-shaped warnings in private. I saw that, Elena, 3 nights ago, when he thought no one else was watching. I was not looking for it. I simply happened to be positioned where I could see. Elena's face went pale. That was nothing. He was only emphasizing a point. He does that sometimes, when he's worried about something. Does he worry about many things, involving your arm specifically? The question, gentle as it was, landed like a small blow. Elena stood abruptly, putting distance between herself and the bench, between herself and the careful, patient way Dorian kept finding the exact cracks in her defenses. I should go, she said. This conversation isn't appropriate. Elena. Dorian's voice remained calm, but something in it made her pause despite herself. I am not asking you these questions to embarrass you, or to trap you into saying something you'll regret. I am asking because I believe you are not safe in that household, and because I have both the ability and the responsibility to do something about it, if that belief turns out to be correct. But I cannot help you if you continue insisting that nothing is wrong. Maybe nothing is wrong, Elena said, though her voice wavered on the words in a way that betrayed her more than she intended. Then tell me that, and mean it, and I will drop the subject entirely, and never raise it again. Dorian rose from the bench, closing some of the distance she had created, though he stopped well short of crowding her. Look at me, Elena, and tell me you are safe and happy in that house, and that nothing about your life there troubles you. If you can say it and I believe you, I will let this go. Elena opened her mouth to say exactly that, the practiced words she had delivered 1,000 times to 1,000 people who had never once looked closely enough to doubt them. But something about Dorian's steady, patient gaze made the familiar lie catch in her throat, refusing to come out smooth and easy the way it always had before. "I can't," she whispered finally, the admission slipping out before she could stop it. 3 small words that felt like the first crack in a dam she had spent years reinforcing. "I can't say it." Dorian's expression did not change to triumph or satisfaction, only to something quiet and grave, as though a suspicion he had hoped might prove wrong had just been confirmed. "Thank you for telling me the truth," he said softly. "I know that cost you something." Elena felt tears threatening, unwelcome and unfamiliar, and pressed her hand hard against her mouth to keep them contained. "Please," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Please don't do anything. If Marcus finds out I said anything at all, it will be so much worse. You don't understand what he's capable of when he feels threatened." "I understand more than you think," Dorian said, "and I promise you, I will not act carelessly. But I cannot simply walk away and pretend I don't know what I know now. Not when it means leaving you in danger." "It's not danger," Elena said quickly, some old, deeply ingrained instinct rising to Marcus's defense even now. "It's not like that. He's careful, mostly. It's just words, sometimes. Just control. It's not the kind of thing that... It doesn't need to be the worst possible version of harm to still be harm," Dorian said gently, cutting through her attempts to minimize what she had just revealed. "You don't need to convince me it isn't serious enough to matter. I already believe it matters." Elena sat back down on the bench, suddenly exhausted, the weight of years of careful concealment pressing down on her all at once, now that the first crack had opened. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now," Dorian said, sitting beside her again, closer this time, though still careful to leave her the space to move away if she needed it. "I ask you to trust me a little longer. I need to gather more information before I act. Information that will protect you, rather than expose you to greater risk. Can you do that? Can you trust me, even a little, while I work out how to help you safely?" Elena studied him for a long moment, this stranger who had arrived only days ago, and somehow seen through years of careful practice in a way no one else ever had. "I don't know how," she admitted. "I don't know how to trust anyone with this. I never have." "Then let's start small," Dorian said. "Trust me enough to meet me here again tomorrow. Nothing more than that. For now." Elena nodded slowly, something loosening in her chest that had been tight for so long she had almost forgotten what its absence might feel like. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow." She walked home that evening in a daze, uncertain whether she had made a terrible mistake or taken the first step towards something she had stopped allowing herself to hope for years ago. Marcus was waiting, as always, demanding a full account of the conversation, and Elena delivered the version she had prepared carefully on the walk home. Vague questions about the territory, nothing of substance, nothing worth his concern. He seemed to accept it, though the wariness in his eyes did not fully fade. Elena climbed the stairs to her room that night, carrying a secret heavier than any she had held before, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to wonder whether the weight of it might finally, someday soon, no longer be hers to carry alone. Sleep did not come easily. She lay awake, replaying the conversation in the garden, turning over every word Dorian had spoken, searching for some hidden trap she might have missed, some reason this could still go badly wrong. Years of careful survival had taught her to distrust exactly this kind of moment, the sudden appearance of someone offering help, someone who seemed to see clearly what everyone else had overlooked for so long. It felt too easy, too fortunate, to be entirely trustworthy. And yet, when she examined the feeling honestly, what she found beneath the fear was something she'd barely recognized: relief. The simple, staggering relief of having said 3 true words aloud to another person, after years of denying them even to herself. "I can't say it." She had not planned to admit that much. It had simply come, pulled loose by the patient, unhurried way Dorian had waited for her, refusing to accept the easy lie she had offered 1,000 times before, to 1,000 less attentive listeners. She thought of her mother, briefly, wondering what Grace would have made of a king walking these same forest paths, noticing what an entire pack had somehow managed not to see for 6 years. She liked to think her mother would have approved of Dorian's careful, deliberate patience, the way he had refused to rush her, refused to demand more than she could safely give in a single conversation. The following morning brought its usual routine, though Elena moved through it with a strange, unfamiliar awareness humming beneath her careful composure. She caught herself, more than once, almost smiling at nothing in particular, a habit so foreign to her recent years that Oliver noticed immediately when they crossed paths near the training field. "You look different today," he said, studying her with open curiosity. "Lighter somehow. Did something happen?" "Nothing happened," Elena said, though the automatic denial came without its usual sharp edge of panic. "You're smiling," Oliver pointed out. "I don't think I've seen you smile, without trying to hide it, in months." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, unsure how to explain even a fraction of what had shifted, without revealing more than she was ready to share. "Maybe I just slept well," she offered instead. Oliver did not look entirely convinced, but he let the subject rest, the way he always did, though something in his expression suggested he filed the observation away for later consideration. "Well, whatever it is," he said, "I'm glad to see it. You deserve more days like this one." The words settled somewhere warm in Elena's chest, small but meaningful, another quiet reminder that she was not entirely without people who cared, even if circumstances had made it difficult for that care to reach her in any useful way. She thanked him, and continued through her morning duties with a lightness she hadn't felt in years, careful not to let it show too obviously whenever Marcus was nearby. Marcus, for his part, seemed distracted that morning, consumed by preparations for a formal negotiation session scheduled with Dorian and the senior pack council regarding the border treaty renewal. Elena caught fragments of conversation as she moved through the house, enough to understand that whatever business had officially brought the king to Ashwood was proceeding according to expected timelines, giving her a rough sense of how many more days remained before the visit concluded and Dorian returned north. The thought unsettled her more than she expected. She had spent 3 days assuming his eventual departure would restore her life to its familiar, contained rhythm, and had found something like safety in that assumption. Now, having admitted the truth aloud for the first time, the idea of Dorian leaving without resolving anything felt suddenly unbearable. A door opened only to be shut again, before she could fully understand what lay beyond it. She found herself, throughout the day, watching the passage of time with an anticipation she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember, waiting for the moment she could return to the garden and continue the conversation that had begun cracking something open inside her that she had thought permanently sealed. The negotiation session dragged on far longer than expected, and by the time Elena managed to slip away toward the guest house gardens, the afternoon light had already begun sloping toward evening. She found Dorian pacing near the fountain, an unusual restlessness in his movements that stilled the moment he saw her approaching. "I was beginning to worry you wouldn't come," he admitted. "I said I would," Elena said, settling onto the same bench they had shared the day before, though this time she left less distance between them, a small, deliberate choice that did not go unnoticed. "You did," Dorian agreed, sitting beside her, "though I've learned, in my experience, that promises can become considerably harder to keep when someone else holds enough power to make keeping them dangerous." Elena said nothing to that, the truth of it settling quietly between them. "How was the negotiation?" she asked instead, eager to postpone whatever difficult conversation waited ahead. "Productive. On the surface," Dorian said. "Elder Simon is a capable negotiator, and Marcus contributed useful logistics regarding the eastern border patrols. Beneath the surface, I found myself considerably less interested in border logistics than in the man sitting across the table from me, watching me with the particular wariness of someone convinced I know something dangerous about him. Does he suspect?" "I believe he suspects something," Dorian said carefully. "Whether he has identified exactly what, I cannot say. Men like Marcus tend to be skilled at reading rooms, at sensing when the ground beneath them has shifted even slightly. I imagine your changed demeanor over the past 2 days has not escaped his notice either." Elena's stomach tightened at the thought. "I've been careful. I'm sure you have. But Oliver noticed a change in you yesterday. By your own account, if a friend who sees you occasionally noticed, I would be surprised if a guardian who watches you daily missed it entirely." The observation settled uncomfortably, and Elena found herself glancing instinctively toward the path that led back to Marcus's house, as though he might appear at any moment to confirm the fear taking shape in her chest. "What do we do?" she asked. "We proceed carefully," Dorian said. "I've spent the past 2 days gathering what information I can, quietly, without drawing attention to my intentions. I've spoken with several members of the household staff, with Elder Simon regarding pack law and the process for reviewing guardianship arrangements, and with my own advisors about the appropriate way to intervene without creating a situation more dangerous for you than the one that currently exists." "And what have you found?" "Enough to be certain that acting is the right choice, and not nearly enough yet to act with the kind of certainty a formal accusation would require. Pack law is careful about these matters, Elena. An enforcer of Marcus's standing cannot simply be stripped of his position and his guardianship on the word of observation alone, however troubling that observation might be. I need evidence, testimony, something that will hold up when Marcus, as he inevitably will, denies every accusation and paints you as confused, or troubled, or ungrateful." Elena's hands twisted together in her lap. "That's exactly what he'll say," she said quietly. "He's already told the elders I'm unstable, in case I ever tried to speak up. No one will believe me over him." "They might not believe you alone," Dorian acknowledged. "But they will find it considerably harder to dismiss testimony corroborated by household staff, by physical evidence, by a pattern of behavior documented over time, rather than a single unsupported claim. I do not intend to ask you to stand alone against him, Elena. I intend to build a case strong enough that standing alone is never required." Something in his steady, methodical determination eased a fraction of the fear coiled in Elena's chest, though the underlying dread remained. "How long will that take?" "I don't know yet," Dorian admitted. "Longer than I would like, given how urgently I want you out of that house. But rushing this could cost you more than patience will. I need you to trust the process, even when it feels slower than you can bear." Elena was quiet for a long moment, watching the fountain's water catch the last light of the afternoon. "I don't know how to do that," she said finally. "Trust things. I stopped believing anyone would actually follow through on protecting me a long time ago." "I understand why," Dorian said gently, "and I won't pretend I can undo years of that belief with a handful of conversations. But I can promise you this. I do not make commitments I don't intend to keep, and I have committed to seeing this through, whatever it requires. You don't need to trust the outcome yet, Elena. You only need to trust that I am genuinely trying." Elena studied him, this careful, patient stranger who had upended the fragile equilibrium of her life within a matter of days, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she believed him. Not entirely, not without reservation, but enough to feel something shift in her chest, some old, exhausted weight easing just slightly under the promise of shared burden. "All right," she said, "I'll try." "That's all I'm asking," Dorian said, and something in his expression, quiet and warm, suggested the admission meant more to him than his measured tone let on. They sat together for a while longer, the conversation drifting toward safer subjects, the healing work Elena had once dreamed of pursuing, the northern territories Dorian ruled, and the particular challenges of governing a pack so much larger than Ashwood, small observations about the forest around them that had nothing to do with fear or danger at all. It was, Elena realized somewhere in the middle of it, the first entirely comfortable conversation she had shared with anyone in longer than she could remember, a small pocket of ordinary human connection, carved out of a life that had offered her precious little of it. The sun had nearly set by the time she finally rose to leave, aware that her absence would soon draw unwanted attention at home. Dorian walked her to the edge of the garden, stopping short of the path that would carry her back toward Marcus's house. "Be careful tonight," he said. "If he questions you about today, tell him as little as possible. Deflect where you can." "I will," Elena said. "And Elena." Dorian's voice softened further, something careful and deliberate in the way he held her gaze. "Whatever happens in the coming days, I need you to remember that none of this is your fault. Nothing he has done to you reflects anything true about your worth. I want you to hold on to that, even when it's hard to believe." Elena felt her throat tighten unexpectedly, tears threatening for the second time in 2 days after years of carefully suppressing them. "Thank you," she managed. She walked home through the darkening forest with those words settled deep in her chest, a small, steady warmth against the cold uncertainty of what still lay ahead. She did not yet know how quickly Marcus's suspicions would sharpen into something more dangerous, or how soon the careful, quiet investigation Dorian had begun would collide directly with the temper she had spent years learning to avoid provoking. That collision, when it came, arrived faster than either of them expected. Marcus was waiting when she reached the house, and one look at his face told Elena immediately that something had changed since that morning. His expression carried none of its usual careful composure, replaced instead by a tight, barely contained anger that made her steps falter at the threshold. "Where were you?" he said, not a question, a demand. "I was walking," Elena said, falling back on the same explanation she had offered before, though her voice wavered slightly under the intensity of his stare. "Don't lie to me." Marcus's voice had dropped into the register she feared most, quiet and controlled, in a way that promised far worse than shouting ever could. "One of the household staff saw you in the guest house gardens. With him. Again." Elena's heart began pounding hard against her ribs. "He asked to speak with me about the border paths," she said, the excuse feeling flimsier now than it ever had before, transparent even to her own ears. "I couldn't refuse a direct request from the king. You could have found a reason. You could have kept your distance, exactly as I instructed you to." Marcus took a step closer, and Elena forced herself not to retreat, though every instinct screamed at her to put distance between them. "What have you told him, Elena?" "Nothing," she said. "I promise, nothing about." "Don't lie to me," Marcus said again, sharper this time, and Elena felt the familiar, cold spread of fear move through her chest, the particular fear that came from watching his control slip further than she had seen it slip in a long time. "I have worked too hard, for too many years, building this reputation, this standing in the pack, for you to threaten it now, with whatever foolish confessions you think a king's attention entitles you to make." "I haven't told him anything," Elena said, though the lie felt weaker now, less convincing than it had 2 days ago, before something had cracked open inside her that she was no longer certain she could seal shut again. Marcus studied her for a long, tense moment, and Elena watched something calculate behind his eyes, some decision forming that she could not yet name but instinctively feared. "You will not see him again," he said finally. "Not in the gardens, not on the paths, not anywhere without my direct supervision. If he requests your presence, you will tell him you are occupied with household duties. If he approaches you directly, you will excuse yourself immediately. Do you understand me?" "Marcus, please. Do you understand me?" His voice cracked like a whip through the quiet room, and Elena flinched despite herself, the old, ingrained instinct to comply rising automatically to the surface. "Yes," she whispered, "I understand." Marcus nodded once, sharp and final, and turned away, leaving Elena standing alone in the hallway, shaking slightly with the aftermath of an anger she hadn't seen him display so openly in years. She climbed the stairs to her room on unsteady legs, closed the door behind her, and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time, trying to steady her breathing. Something had shifted tonight, she understood. Some careful balance that had held for years finally beginning to tip. She did not know yet whether that shift would carry her toward safety or toward greater danger. She only knew, with a certainty that frightened her more than Marcus's anger had, that there was no path left that led back to the careful, contained silence she had lived within before Dorian's arrival. The forest outside her window swayed gently in the evening wind, indifferent to the quiet crisis unfolding within the walls it surrounded, and Elena sat awake long into the night, waiting for morning and whatever new danger it might bring. That same night, in the guest house across the residential district, Dorian sat with Charlotte and Adam, the captain of his personal guard, reviewing the fragments of information gathered over the past several days. A small collection of notes lay spread across the table between them, observations from staff conversations, dates and times of Elena's occasional visible bruising during her early years in Marcus's household, and a brief, troubling account from the school counselor Elena had once confided in, tracked down through Charlotte's careful inquiries. "The counselor remembers the conversation clearly," Charlotte said, reading from her notes. "A girl, 16 years old, bruising along her forearm, explained away as a training accident. The counselor admits now she never followed up, that Marcus's reputation made the explanation easy to accept without question." "Convenient," Adam said grimly, "how reputation smooths over exactly the kind of doubt that might otherwise save someone." "It usually does," Dorian said, his voice tight with the particular anger he reserved for injustice, dressed up as respectability. "That's precisely how men like Marcus continue, year after year, without consequence. No single piece of evidence is damning enough alone. It's only when you gather enough of them together that the pattern becomes impossible to explain away. We don't have enough yet, Charlotte said carefully. Not for a formal accusation before the Pack Council. Elder Simon will ask for direct testimony, physical evidence current enough to matter, and right now, what we have is largely historical, second-hand, and circumstantial. I'm aware, Dorian said, which is why I intend to proceed carefully, rather than rushing toward an accusation we cannot yet fully support. But after tonight, I suspect our timeline has shortened considerably. What happened tonight? Adam asked. Marcus knows Elena and I have spoken privately, more than once. A member of the household staff reported seeing us together in the gardens. I don't yet know how he reacted, but given what we already understand about his temperament, I doubt it was calmly. Dorian's jaw tightened. I fear our attention may have made her situation more dangerous, rather than less, at least in the short term. That's always the risk with an investigation like this, Charlotte said gently. Sometimes shining light on a hidden situation causes the person controlling it to tighten their grip before you can intervene. It doesn't mean we were wrong to look. It means we need to move faster than we'd planned. Dorian nodded slowly, his mind already turning toward next steps. I want a formal medical examination arranged, discreetly, through a healer Marcus has no influence over. If there is current physical evidence, we need it documented properly, by someone whose testimony the council cannot easily dismiss. There's a healer at the edge of the territory, Adam offered. Nora, I believe her name is. Independent of Pack politics, well respected among the elders for her integrity. Elena has visited her before, according to what the staff mentioned. Good, Dorian said. Charlotte, reach out to her tomorrow, carefully. I want to know if she has ever treated Elena for anything beyond ordinary injuries, and I want her willing to speak with the council if it becomes necessary. Charlotte made a note, then looked up, her expression carrying a caution Dorian recognized well. You understand that even with all of this, Marcus may still walk away from a council hearing largely unscathed. Men of his standing usually do, unless the evidence is truly overwhelming. I understand, Dorian said quietly, which is exactly why I don't intend to stop gathering evidence until it is overwhelming. Elena has spent 6 years being disbelieved by everyone positioned to help her. I will not add myself to that list by moving too cautiously to make a real difference. The room fell quiet for a moment, the weight of the task ahead settling over all three of them. Finally, Adam spoke, his voice carrying the blunt practicality that made him valuable in moments exactly like this one. There's another matter to consider, he said. Her safety, in the immediate term. If Marcus's temper is escalating tonight, as you suspect, waiting several more days to gather sufficient evidence could put her at real risk before we're ready to act. I've thought of that, Dorian said. I intend to request, formally, that Elena be permitted to spend time assisting the royal party with translation and territory knowledge during the remainder of our visit. It's a reasonable request, given her familiarity with the eastern paths, and it would give us legitimate grounds to keep her nearby, away from Marcus's direct supervision, for at least part of each day. He'll refuse, Charlotte said, especially now, given what you've just described. He may try, Dorian agreed. But refusing a direct request from a visiting Alpha King, without a reasonable justification that doesn't reveal his true motivations, will be considerably more difficult for him than continuing his usual private control. I intend to make that request tomorrow morning, in front of Elder Simon, where refusing it carries its own social cost. Charlotte and Adam exchanged a glance, both recognizing the careful, deliberate strategy taking shape. Not a single dramatic confrontation, but a series of small, calculated pressures, designed to make Marcus's continued control increasingly difficult to maintain, without exposing exactly what he had spent years hiding. It's a good plan, Adam said finally. Slow, but good. I only hope it moves fast enough. So do I, Dorian said quietly, his gaze drifting toward the window, toward the dark shape of the residential district where Elena sat awake, unaware of the careful machinery beginning to turn on her behalf. So do I. Morning brought a summons Elena had not expected. Marcus appeared at her door earlier than usual, his expression tightly controlled in a way that told her he had already braced himself for something unpleasant. You've been requested, he said, to assist the royal party with territory knowledge for the remainder of their visit. Elder Simon has approved it. Elena blinked, momentarily too surprised to respond. Requested by whom? You know exactly by whom, Marcus said, his voice tight. I tried to explain that you had household duties requiring your attention, but the king insisted your familiarity with the eastern paths would prove valuable for their remaining assessments of the border territory. Elder Simon agreed it would be discourteous to refuse. Elena felt something like hope flicker uncertainly in her chest, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. When do I begin? This morning, Marcus said. You will report to the guest house at once. He studied her for a long moment, something calculating and dangerous behind his eyes. Understand this, Elena. Whatever time you spend with him, whatever conversations occur, you will remember exactly what is at stake for this household. If you say anything that damages my standing in this pack, I promise you will regret it far more than any temporary comfort his attention might offer. I understand, Elena said, though something in her had begun, quietly and carefully, to stop believing that his threats carried the same absolute power they once had. She left for the guest house within the hour, her heart pounding, with a mixture of relief and apprehension she hadn't fully processed by the time she arrived. Dorian met her near the entrance, his expression softening slightly at the sight of her, though he kept his tone carefully professional, for the benefit of the guards nearby. Thank you for coming, he said. I hope the request didn't cause you too much trouble. Marcus wasn't pleased, Elena admitted quietly, once they had moved to a more private corner of the garden. But he couldn't refuse without raising questions he clearly didn't want asked. That was rather the point, Dorian said. I'm sorry to put you in the position of managing his anger over this. I judged it a necessary risk, given how quickly things seemed to be shifting after last night. What exactly changed last night? Elena asked. You said things had shifted. Dorian hesitated, weighing how much to share. We've gathered enough information to begin building a formal case, he said finally. Testimony from staff, a record from a counselor you spoke with years ago, and soon, hopefully, an independent medical assessment from Nora, if you're willing to allow one. Elena's stomach tightened at the mention of Nora. You spoke to her. Charlotte did, this morning, carefully. She hasn't pressed for details yet. She wanted your permission first. Dorian's gaze softened. I know this feels like everything is moving very fast, Elena, faster than you're ready for. If you need more time before involving Nora formally, I will respect that. Elena considered this for a long moment. Memories of years spent minimizing every mark, every explanation offered too quickly to too many disinterested adults, rising uncomfortably to the surface. No, she said finally, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. I want to do this. I'm tired of pretending everything is fine. I'm tired of protecting a reputation that was never mine to protect in the first place. Something like quiet pride flickered across Dorian's expression. Then I'll have Charlotte arrange a visit with Nora this afternoon, somewhere private, away from anywhere Marcus might notice. They spent the remainder of the morning walking sections of the eastern border paths, ostensibly for the territory assessment that had provided their cover, though the conversation drifted naturally into easier, more personal territory as the hours passed. Elena found herself talking more freely than she had in years, describing small memories of her mother, half-forgotten dreams of studying healing, observations about the pack she had never felt safe voicing aloud before. Dorian listened with the same careful, patient attention he had shown from their very first conversation, asking questions that revealed genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation, offering small pieces of his own life in return, stories of his own difficult childhood before ascending to the throne, the weight of responsibility that came with ruling a territory as vast as the northern packs, the loneliness that often accompanied a position everyone assumed should feel like privilege rather than burden. I understand loneliness, Elena admitted, somewhere in the middle of the afternoon, as they paused near a small overlook where the forest opened onto a view of distant hills. I've felt it for years, even surrounded by an entire pack. I imagine isolation feels different when it's engineered, rather than circumstantial, Dorian said quietly. Marcus isolated you deliberately, didn't he? Kept you from forming the kinds of connections that might have noticed what was happening sooner. Elena nodded slowly. I didn't understand that's what it was, for a long time. I thought I simply preferred to keep to myself. It took me years to realize how carefully that preference had been shaped. That's a common pattern, Dorian said, something dark passing briefly behind his eyes. Isolation is rarely accidental in situations like this. It's a tool, deployed carefully, to ensure there's no one positioned to notice or intervene. They walked in comfortable silence for a while after that, the weight of the conversation settling naturally, rather than uncomfortably between them. Elena found herself, more than once, glancing at Dorian's profile as he studied the landscape, wondering at the strange, sudden way this stranger had become someone she trusted more than almost anyone else in her life. The afternoon meeting with Nora took place quietly at the healer's cottage, arranged carefully to avoid drawing Marcus's attention. Nora listened to Elena's careful, halting account with the same patient stillness she brought to everything, her expression softening with a grief that suggested long-held suspicion, finally confirmed rather than genuine surprise. I wondered, for years, Nora admitted quietly, once Elena had finished. I never had proof enough to act on the wondering. I'm sorry I never pushed harder. You couldn't have known for certain, Elena said. I made sure of that. I was very careful. You shouldn't have had to be, Nora said, something fierce entering her usually gentle voice. Not at your age, not for so many years. I'll help however I can, Elena. Whatever testimony you need, whatever documentation supports what you've endured, I'll provide it. The examination that followed was brief and careful, conducted with a professional gentleness that made the necessary process feel less invasive than Elena had feared. When it concluded, Nora's expression carried a grim confirmation that settled heavily in the small cottage. There's enough here, Nora said quietly, addressing Dorian, who waited outside during the examination itself, and had been invited back in once it concluded. Historical evidence, consistent with a pattern of harm extending back years. It won't be pleasant testimony to give, but it will hold up before the council. Dorian nodded, his jaw tight with a controlled anger Elena had come to recognize over the past several days. Thank you, Nora. I know this wasn't an easy thing to ask of you. It was an easy thing to ask, Nora said. It's an easy thing to give, when it means finally protecting someone who's needed protecting for far too long. Elena sat quietly through the exchange, feeling strangely detached from her own body, as though the process of finally having her experience, acknowledged by someone with the authority to act on it, existed somewhere just outside her full comprehension. It was one thing to admit the truth to Dorian in a quiet garden conversation. It was another entirely to watch that truth transform into evidence, into testimony, into the first real steps toward consequences that might finally reach Marcus after 6 years of careful invisibility. What happens now? She asked, once Nora had finished packing away her instruments. Now, Dorian said, we present this to Elder Simon and the Pack Council, carefully, and with enough supporting evidence that Marcus cannot simply dismiss it as the confused imagination of a troubled girl, as I suspect he's already prepared to claim. When? Soon, Dorian said. I don't intend to wait longer than necessary, not now that we have what we need, but I want to prepare you first, Elena. This will not be easy. Marcus will fight this with everything his reputation affords him. He may say things about you designed to hurt, designed to make you doubt whether coming forward was worth it. Elena felt fear rise sharp in her chest, but beneath it, something steadier had begun to take root over the past several days, something that had not existed in her before Dorian's careful, patient attention had cracked open the silence she'd maintained for so long. I'm ready, she said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it. Elena returned home that evening, later than usual, the weight of the day's events settling heavily over her as she approached the familiar house at the edge of the residential district. She had rehearsed, carefully, the explanation she intended to offer Marcus for her lateness, though nothing could fully prepare her for the tension she found waiting behind the front door. Marcus stood in the front room, arms crossed, his expression carrying a controlled fury that immediately set every instinct in Elena's body on alert. Where have you been? He said, the same demand from 2 nights before, though this time delivered with even less patience. Assisting the king's assessment of the Eastern Territory, Elena said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. As I was instructed to do. For an entire day? Marcus's eyes narrowed. One of the guards mentioned you were seen leaving the healer's cottage this afternoon. What business did you have there? Elena's heart stumbled, but she forced her expression to remain composed. I had a headache, she said. Nora gave me something for it, the same as she has before. You expect me to believe that took an entire afternoon? I stayed to talk, Elena said. Nora and I have always spoken easily. There's nothing unusual in that. Marcus studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment, and Elena held herself as still as possible, aware that any flicker of the fear coursing beneath her calm exterior would only confirm whatever suspicion was already forming behind his eyes. You've changed these past few days, he said finally, his voice quiet and dangerous. You've grown careless, confident, in a way I don't like. I want to know why. I don't know what you mean, Elena said. Don't insult me by pretending, Marcus said, taking a step closer, and Elena forced herself not to retreat, though every muscle in her body wanted to. I have spent 6 years teaching you exactly how to behave, exactly what is expected of you, and in the space of a single week, all of that discipline seems to be unraveling. I want to know what he has promised you, what lies he has filled your head with, to make you forget everything I've taught you about gratitude, about knowing your place. He hasn't promised me anything, Elena said, though her voice wavered slightly, betraying more than she intended. Marcus's hand closed around her arm, not gently, and Elena felt the old, familiar fear spike sharp and immediate through her chest. Listen to me carefully, he said, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper, somehow more frightening than any shout could have been. Whatever you think is happening, whatever foolish hope he's given you, understand this. He will leave, Elena. In a few days, this visit will end, and he will return north to his own territory, his own concerns, and you will still be here, with me. And I promise you, if you have said anything at all, to embarrass this household or threaten my standing, you will regret it far longer than his visit will last. You're hurting me, Elena said quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. 3 small words she had never once dared to speak aloud to him before. Marcus's grip loosened immediately, some flicker of surprise crossing his face at her unexpected directness, though it was quickly replaced by renewed anger. Don't test me, he said, releasing her arm entirely and stepping back. Go to your room. I don't want to see you again tonight. Elena climbed the stairs on shaking legs, closing her door behind her and pressing her back against it, breathing hard, as the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly drained from her body. She examined the faint red marks already forming along her forearm, the newest evidence in a pattern that had repeated itself countless times over the years, and found herself, for the first time, thinking not of how to hide the marks, but of how Nora had documented exactly this kind of evidence only hours before. The thought steadied her more than she expected. Whatever happened next, whatever consequences Marcus's growing suspicion might bring, she was no longer facing it entirely alone. She sat by her window for a long while, watching the dark shapes of the trees sway in the evening wind, and allowed herself, cautiously, to hope that the coming days might finally bring the ending she had stopped believing was possible. She did not know, as she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, that Marcus had already begun making plans of his own, plans that would force the careful, patient timeline Dorian had built toward a far more urgent and dangerous conclusion than any of them had anticipated. Elena woke before dawn, to the sound of raised voices downstairs, sharp and urgent in a way that immediately pulled her from sleep. She dressed quickly and crept to the top of the stairs, straining to hear the conversation taking place below. Cannot simply leave in the middle of the night, Marcus, without explanation. Elder Simon will ask questions. It was Henry's voice, one of Marcus's closest allies among the pack enforcers, his tone carrying an edge of confusion that suggested he had been woken suddenly to receive whatever news Marcus was delivering. I'll give the elders whatever explanation is necessary, Marcus said, his voice tight with barely controlled urgency. A sudden assignment along the northern border. Something requiring immediate attention. It won't be questioned if I present it correctly. And the girl? Comes with me, Marcus said. I won't leave her here for him to continue whatever manipulation he's begun. Once we're away from Ashwood, away from his influence, I can undo whatever damage these past days have caused. Elena's blood ran cold. She understood immediately what she was hearing. Marcus intended to remove her from the territory entirely, to separate her from Dorian, and the careful case being built on her behalf, before either could reach any kind of resolution. If he succeeded, she understood with sudden sharp clarity, everything Dorian had worked to build over the past several days would collapse, and she would be entirely alone again, likely somewhere even more isolated than Ashwood had been. She retreated silently to her room, her mind racing. She had perhaps a few hours, if Marcus's plan involved leaving before the pack fully woke for the day, to find some way to alert Dorian before it was too late. But leaving the house unnoticed, with Marcus already suspicious and alert, would be more dangerous than anything she had attempted in years. She thought of Oliver, whose house lay along a path she could reach without passing directly by the front room, where Marcus and Henry continued their urgent conversation. It was a risk, but the only one available to her. She slipped down the back stairs, moving as silently as her years of careful practice allowed, and eased out through the kitchen door into the cold pre-dawn air. The walk to Oliver's family home took longer than she wanted, every sound in the quiet forest setting her nerves further on edge, certain at any moment she would hear Marcus's voice calling her name in fury. Oliver answered his door still half asleep, his confusion clearing rapidly at the sight of Elena's pale, frightened expression. "Elena? What's wrong? I need you to get a message to King Dorian," she said, her words tumbling out fast and urgent. "Marcus is planning to leave the territory before dawn, and he's taking me with him. I don't have time to explain everything, but please, Oliver, you have to hurry." Oliver's expression shifted rapidly from confusion to grim understanding, years of quiet observation finally crystallizing into clarity. "I knew something was wrong," he said, already reaching for his boots. "I should have pushed harder, asked more directly, done something." "There's no time for that now," Elena said. "Please, just get the message to him. Tell him what I told you." "I will," Oliver said. "Go back before Marcus notices you're missing. I'll run to the guest house myself." Elena nodded, gratitude and fear warring in her chest in equal measure, and hurried back through the forest toward the house she had slipped out of only minutes before. She managed to return to her room undetected, her heart still pounding, and sat on the edge of her bed listening to the continued murmur of voices downstairs, praying that Oliver would reach Dorian in time. The wait felt endless. Elena watched the sky slowly lighten through her window, marking the passage of time with growing dread, wondering if she had acted quickly enough, wondering what Marcus's plan actually involved, and how soon he intended to force her from the only life she had ever known. The knock on her door came sooner than she expected. "Get dressed," Marcus said, his voice carrying none of its usual careful control. "We're leaving within the hour. Pack only what you need." "Where are we going?" Elena asked, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the panic clawing at her chest. "Somewhere you'll finally remember your place," Marcus said, and closed the door before she could ask anything further. Elena moved through the motions of packing with hands that shook despite her efforts to steady them, her mind racing through every possible outcome, every way this could still go wrong, despite the message she had sent. She had no way of knowing whether Oliver had reached Dorian in time, whether the king would arrive before Marcus forced her from the territory entirely, or whether she was about to be swept away into exactly the kind of isolated, controlled existence she had spent the past week beginning to hope she might finally escape. She was halfway through packing a small bag when raised voices erupted downstairs again, different this time, carrying an authority that made her heart leap with sudden, desperate hope. "Will explain to me directly, Marcus, why you intend to remove your ward from this territory in the middle of the night, without so much as informing the Pack Council of your departure." Dorian's voice. Elena abandoned her packing entirely and moved to the top of the stairs, watching as Marcus stood in the front room, facing not only Dorian, but Elder Simon and several senior pack enforcers, all gathered with an urgency that suggested Oliver's message had reached far beyond simply the king's ears. "Your Majesty," Marcus said, his composure visibly straining under the weight of so many witnesses. "This is a private household matter. A sudden assignment requires my attention along the northern border, and my ward accompanies me, as is entirely within my rights as her guardian." "Is that so?" Dorian said, his voice carrying a coldness Elena had not yet heard from him. "Elder Simon, are you aware of any assignment requiring Marcus's presence along the northern border this morning?" Elder Simon's expression had gone carefully neutral, though something calculating moved behind his eyes as he studied Marcus. I am not, he said. No such assignment has crossed my attention. Marcus's jaw tightened. It's a recent development. I intended to inform the council upon my departure. In the middle of the night, Dorian said, without informing anyone beforehand. Removing a young woman from the territory before dawn, with no witnesses present to confirm the nature or necessity of this sudden journey. He took a step closer, and Elena, watching from the stairs, saw something in Marcus's posture that she had never witnessed before, a flicker of genuine fear beneath his practiced composure. Forgive me, Marcus, if I find this explanation considerably less than convincing. With respect, Your Majesty, Marcus said, his voice tightening further. I don't believe the private arrangements of my household are a matter for royal intervention, however elevated your standing. They become a matter for intervention, Dorian said, his voice dropping into something quiet and absolutely unyielding, when I have credible reason to believe that household conceals harm being done to a member of this pack. And I do have such reason, Marcus. Considerable reason, gathered carefully over the past several days. The room fell utterly silent. Elena watched Marcus's face drain of color, watched the careful mask he had maintained for 6 years begin, finally, visibly, to crack. I don't know what lies you've been told, Marcus said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier certainty, but I assure you, whatever you believe you've heard is a gross misunderstanding. Elena has always been treated with care in my household. I took her in when no one else would, raised her as my own after her mother's death, and this is the thanks I receive. Elena, Dorian said, cutting through Marcus's protest, his gaze finding her where she stood frozen at the top of the stairs. Would you come down, please? I would like you present for this conversation, if you're able. Elena descended the stairs slowly, aware of every eye in the room turning toward her, aware of Marcus's desperate, warning glare fixed on her face, even as he tried to maintain his composure before the gathered elders. She reached the bottom of the stairs and stood beside Dorian, her legs still unsteady, her heart pounding hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. Elena, Elder Simon said, his tone carrying a gravity she had never heard him direct toward her before. The king has brought serious concerns to my attention this morning, concerns that require your honest account before this council can proceed appropriately. I understand this is difficult, but I need you to tell us the truth, as completely as you're able. Elena looked at Marcus, standing rigid and pale before the assembled elders, his careful public mask finally, irreversibly slipping. She looked at Dorian beside her, steady and patient, waiting without pressure for whatever she chose to say. She thought of 6 years of careful silence, of bruises explained away as training accidents, of a counselor who had never pushed hard enough to hear the truth, of a lifetime spent believing no one would ever choose to see what stood plainly in front of them. She took a breath, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she chose to speak. It's true, she said, her voice quiet at first, then steadying as the words continued. Everything you suspect is true. For 6 years, since my mother died, Marcus has controlled every part of my life through fear. Not always through anything visible enough for others to question. Careful words, careful grip, careful isolation, so there was never anyone close enough to notice what was happening behind closed doors. That's not, Marcus started, but Elder Simon raised a hand, silencing him with an authority that made clear the elder's patience for interruption had ended. Continue, Elena, Elder Simon said gently. Elena's hands trembled, but her voice held steady. He convinced the school counselor I was troubled, so that if I ever tried to speak up, no one would believe me. He forbade me from studying healing with Nora, because he said it wasn't a good use of my time, though I think now, it was simply another way to control what I was allowed to want. He isolated me from friends, from anyone who might have asked too many questions, and whenever I displeased him, whenever I made even a small mistake, he made sure I understood exactly how easily my entire life could become worse. She looked at Marcus, who stood frozen, his expression a mixture of fury and something that might have been genuine panic, at watching his careful reputation dissolve in real time, before the very elders who had trusted him for years. Yesterday, Nora examined me, Elena continued. She documented evidence of a pattern, extending back years. And last night, when he grew angry that I had spoken with the king, he gripped my arm hard enough to leave marks that are still there now, if anyone wishes to see them. Elder Simon's expression had gone grave, his gaze shifting between Elena and Marcus with an intensity that suggested years of accumulated trust were rapidly unraveling. "Marcus," he said quietly, "is this true?" "She's confused," Marcus said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier authority, cracking slightly under the weight of so many watching eyes. "She's always been an emotional girl, prone to exaggeration. I've done nothing but care for her since her mother's death, and this is how she repays 6 years of sacrifice." "I would like to see the marks she mentioned," Dorian said, his voice cutting cleanly through Marcus's protest. "If Elena is willing to show them." Elena pulled back the sleeve of her nightclothes, revealing the faint but unmistakable bruising along her forearm, still visible from the previous night's confrontation. A murmur passed through the small gathering, several of the senior enforcers exchanging troubled glances at the sight. "This happened last night," Elena said, "when he learned I had spoken with the king about my situation." Elder Simon studied the marks for a long moment, his expression hardening. "Marcus," he said, "I have known you for many years. I have trusted your judgment, your service to this pack, your character. I find myself now questioning whether that trust was ever properly earned." "Elder Simon, please," Marcus said, his composure finally breaking entirely, desperation entering his voice for the first time. "This is a misunderstanding, nothing more. Whatever the king has convinced her to say, whatever confused account she's given, I assure you, I have not convinced her of anything," Dorian said, his voice cold and unyielding. "I have simply asked the questions no one in this pack apparently thought to ask over the past 6 years. I have gathered testimony from household staff who noticed a pattern they were too intimidated by your reputation to question. I have spoken with a counselor who examined bruises on a 16-year-old girl and accepted your explanation without further inquiry, because your standing made doubt inconvenient. And I have witnessed, with my own eyes, the fear this young woman carries every single time you enter a room." Marcus's face had gone pale, his earlier bluster collapsing under the weight of accumulated evidence he clearly had not anticipated being assembled so thoroughly against him. "I want to speak with the council privately," he said, his voice tight. "This is not a matter to be aired before. This matter has been hidden for 6 years, specifically because private conversations allowed it to continue unchecked," Dorian interrupted. "I do not intend to allow it to disappear behind closed doors again." Elder Simon turned to the senior enforcers gathered behind him, exchanging a few quiet words before addressing the room formally. "Marcus," he said, "you are relieved of your position as senior enforcer of this pack, effective immediately, pending a full council review of these allegations. Your guardianship of Elena is suspended pending that same review. You will remain within the residential district, under supervision, until this matter is resolved." "You cannot simply," Marcus began, fury finally breaking through his crumbling composure. "I can, and I have," Elder Simon said, his voice carrying an authority Elena had never heard him direct toward Marcus before. 6 years, Marcus. 6 years this pack trusted you with the care of a grieving child, and this is what that trust apparently purchased. I am ashamed it took a visiting king's attention to notice what should have been obvious to all of us far sooner." The room fell into a heavy, charged silence as 2 of the senior enforcers moved to stand beside Marcus, their expressions carefully neutral, but their presence unmistakably a form of restraint rather than escort. Marcus's eyes found Elena across the room, and for a moment, something in his expression shifted. Not remorse, she understood immediately, but a cold, calculating fury at having been outmaneuvered by someone he had spent years teaching to believe she had no power at all. "You'll regret this," he said quietly, low enough that only Elena, standing closest, fully heard the words. "I don't think I will," Elena said, and found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she meant it entirely. Dorian stepped closer to her, as the enforcers led Marcus from the room, his expression softening from the cold authority he had directed at Marcus into something gentler, more careful. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Elena felt the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly beginning to drain from her body, leaving something shaky and uncertain in its place. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've imagined this moment for years, and now that it's happened, I don't quite know how to feel." "That's understandable," Dorian said. "You don't need to know how to feel yet. You've just done something enormously difficult, Elena. Give yourself time. Elder Simon approached them both, his expression carrying a mixture of grave concern and something like genuine regret. Elena, he said, I owe you an apology I don't know how to adequately give. 6 years is a long time to have gone unseen, unheard, in a pack that should have protected you far better than it did. I intend to see this council review conducted thoroughly and fairly, and I intend to ensure your voice carries the full weight it should have carried from the very beginning. Thank you, Elena said quietly, still absorbing the strange, disorienting reality of finally being believed. In the meantime, Elder Simon continued, you'll need somewhere safe to stay, away from any lingering influence Marcus might attempt to exert during the review process. I'll arrange appropriate accommodations within the pack immediately. She may stay under the royal party's protection, if that would be acceptable to her, Dorian offered. We have guards enough to ensure her safety, and it would remove any question of Marcus's continued access during the proceedings. Elder Simon nodded slowly, considering this. That seems a wise arrangement, given the circumstances. Elena, would that be agreeable to you? Elena looked at Dorian, at the careful, steady patience he had offered her since the very first evening of his visit, and felt something in her chest ease, for what felt like the first time in 6 long years. Yes, she said, I think it would. The days that followed passed in a strange, unfamiliar rhythm for Elena, one built around safety rather than survival for the first time in 6 years. She was given quarters within the guest house, modest but comfortable, and found herself waking each morning without the familiar dread of listening for Marcus's footsteps, without the constant calculation of his mood that had governed every hour of her previous life. The council review, when it convened 3 days later, proved far more thorough than Elena had expected. Nora testified with quiet, careful precision, laying out the physical evidence she had documented with a clinical detachment that somehow made the truth land even harder among the assembled elders. The school counselor, contacted directly by Charlotte, admitted with visible shame to the missed opportunity 6 years earlier, to the bruises dismissed too easily, on the strength of Marcus's reputation alone. Household staff who had noticed the pattern over the years, too intimidated to speak up individually, found their collective testimony carrying a weight that no single account could have managed alone. Elena testified last, standing before the full council, in a room that had once felt impossibly intimidating, and now felt, strangely, like the safest place she had occupied in years. She spoke clearly, without the careful hedging and minimizing that had characterized every previous conversation about her life with Marcus, laying out 6 years of control and fear, with a steadiness that surprised even herself. Marcus, present throughout the proceedings under guard, offered denials that grew increasingly desperate as the evidence accumulated against him, eventually shifting to claims that whatever occurred had been necessary discipline for a difficult, ungrateful ward. The elders, Elena noticed, seemed to grow colder toward him with each such claim, watching the careful public mask he had maintained for 6 years dissolve entirely into something far uglier than anyone in the pack had previously glimpsed. Elder Simon delivered the council's decision on the 4th day, his voice heavy with the weight of judgment long overdue. Marcus was stripped permanently of his position as senior enforcer, his standing within Ashwood revoked entirely, and he was ordered to leave the territory within the week, forbidden from any further contact with Elena. It was, Elder Simon acknowledged publicly, a consequence that should have arrived years earlier, had the pack been more willing to question a reputation rather than accept it unexamined. Elena watched Marcus receive the verdict with an expression she would remember for a long time afterward. Not remorse, still, but a kind of stunned disbelief that the careful, controlled world he had built for himself could actually collapse, that consequences he had spent 6 years successfully avoiding had finally, irreversibly arrived. It's over, Dorian said quietly, standing beside her as the council chamber slowly emptied. Whatever happens next, Elena, that chapter of your life is finished. It doesn't feel real yet, Elena admitted. I keep waiting to wake up and find everything exactly as it was before. That will pass, in time, Dorian said gently. 6 years of fear doesn't simply disappear because the danger has ended. Give yourself patience, Elena. You've earned it. In the days that followed the council's decision, Elena found herself, for the first time in her adult memory, facing the strange, disorienting question of what she actually wanted from her life, unburdened by the careful calculations Marcus's control had required. She visited Nora often, finally beginning the healing studies she had been forbidden years before, finding a quiet satisfaction in the careful, methodical work that felt entirely her own choice, rather than something permitted or denied by someone else's authority. Oliver visited frequently as well, his relief at finally understanding the truth behind years of Elena's careful deflections, evident in every conversation. "I should have pushed harder," he admitted one afternoon, as they sat together near the training field, where they had spent so many mornings over the years. "I noticed things weren't right. I just didn't know how to make you tell me." "You couldn't have made me tell you," Elena said honestly. "I wasn't ready. For years. I don't think anything you could have said would have changed that, until I was ready myself." "Was it him then?" Oliver asked, his gaze drifting toward the guest house where the royal party remained. "Dorian? Is that what changed things?" Elena considered the question carefully. "I think it was that he refused to accept the easy answer," she said finally. "Everyone else took my careful deflections at face value, because it was simpler that way. He didn't. He kept asking, gently, patiently, until I couldn't keep lying to him anymore. I think that's what finally made the difference." Oliver nodded slowly, something thoughtful in his expression. "I'm glad someone finally did," he said. "You deserved that a long time ago." The pack itself seemed to shift subtly in the weeks following Marcus's departure, a quiet reckoning working its way through conversations Elena wasn't always present for but heard about secondhand. Elders questioning how such a pattern had continued unnoticed for so long, staff members expressing quiet regret at observations they had never voiced aloud, a general, uncomfortable acknowledgement that reputation alone should never have been sufficient protection against genuine harm. Elena found herself, in these weeks, slowly rebuilding a version of herself that had been buried for 6 years beneath careful survival instincts, laughing more easily, speaking her opinions without first calculating their safety, allowing herself small preferences and small joys without immediately suppressing them out of habit. It was slow, uneven work, punctuated by moments of unexpected fear that old instincts still triggered without warning, but it was, unmistakably, progress. Dorian remained in Ashwood longer than his original visit had required, the official explanation involving extended negotiations over border logistics that satisfied the pack elders without revealing the truer reason for his continued presence. He spent time with Elena most days, walking the same forest paths that had first brought them together, their conversations gradually shifting from the careful, purposeful discussions of evidence and testimony towards something easier, warmer, built on the foundation of trust that had formed between them during the most difficult days of Elena's life. "You'll need to return north eventually," Elena said one evening, as they sat together near the same fountain where their first real conversation had taken place weeks earlier. "Your own territory needs you." "It does," Dorian agreed, "though I find myself, for the first time in longer than I can remember, reluctant to leave a place I only arrived in by circumstance." Elena felt her heart quicken at the careful weight behind his words. "What are you saying?" Dorian turned to face her fully, his expression open in a way she had rarely seen from him, the careful royal composure giving way to something more honest. "I'm saying that these past weeks have shown me something I didn't expect to find during a routine border negotiation," he said. "I came to Ashwood for a treaty. I found, instead, someone whose strength and resilience I've come to admire more than I know how to properly express." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, an unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with a hope she was only just beginning to allow herself. "I don't know what I'm supposed to say to that," she admitted. "You don't need to say anything yet," Dorian said gently. "I only wanted you to know, whatever happens next, whatever you decide about your future, I want you to know that I see you, Elena, not as someone to be protected, though I will always want to protect you, but as someone remarkable in her own right, someone whose company I have come to value more than I anticipated when I first arrived here." Elena looked at him for a long moment, this steady, patient man who had upended her entire life within the span of a few short weeks, and felt something settle warmly in her chest, something that felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely like hope rather than fear. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for seeing me, for not accepting the easy answer, Even when I gave you every reason to. Always, Dorian said, and the simple, quiet certainty in the word settled something deep within her that had been unsteady for 6 long years. The day of Marcus's departure from the territory arrived quietly, without ceremony, a stark contrast to the respect that had once surrounded his name throughout Ashwood. Elena chose to be present, standing at a careful distance alongside Elder Simon and 2 senior enforcers assigned to escort Marcus beyond the territory boundary, needing to witness the ending of this chapter of her life with her own eyes, rather than simply hearing about it secondhand. Marcus emerged from the small holding quarters where he had spent the final days of the council review, his expression carrying none of the confident authority Elena remembered from her childhood, replaced instead by something bitter and diminished. His eyes found her across the small gathering, and for a moment, Elena braced herself for some final attempt at manipulation, some last effort to make her doubt herself or feel responsible for his downfall. "I hope you're satisfied," he said instead, his voice flat and cold. 6 years of care, thrown away because a king found you interesting enough to indulge for a few weeks. "It wasn't care," Elena said, surprising herself with how steady her voice remained. "I understand that now, even if I didn't always. What you gave me wasn't care, Marcus. It was control dressed up as protection. I'm not sorry it's ended." Something flickered across Marcus's face, gone too quickly for Elena to fully name, though it might have been the first flicker of genuine understanding he had shown throughout the entire proceedings. He said nothing further, turning instead toward the waiting escort, and Elena watched him walk toward the territory boundary without looking back, the final physical presence of 6 years of fear finally, permanently receding from her life. "How do you feel?" Elder Simon asked quietly, once Marcus had disappeared beyond the tree line. Elena considered the question honestly, searching for the answer beneath the complicated tangle of relief and lingering unease that still colored so much of her experience these days. "Lighter," she said finally. "Not entirely free yet, I think, but lighter than I've felt in longer than I can remember." "That seems a reasonable place to begin," Elder Simon said gently. "Healing rarely arrives all at once, Elena. Be patient with yourself." She thought of those words often in the days that followed, turning them over during quiet moments spent among Nora's drying herbs, during long walks through the forest paths that no longer carried the weight of returning to a house full of careful calculation, during conversations with Oliver that had finally shed the guarded edges that had characterized their friendship for years. Each small freedom felt, at first, unfamiliar enough to require conscious attention, as though she were relearning an entirely new way of existing in the world. Nora, more than anyone else in the pack, seemed to understand the particular texture of this slow unfolding. "Grief and relief can exist together," the healer told her one afternoon, as they worked together, preparing herbs for the coming winter season. "You're allowed to feel both, Elena. The loss of 6 years you can't get back, and the relief of finally being free of what took them from you. Neither feeling cancels out the other." "I keep waiting for it to feel simpler than it does," Elena admitted. "It rarely does," Nora said, with the gentle honesty Elena had come to rely on. "But simple isn't the same as impossible. Give it time. You have more of it now than you've had in years, and no one controlling how you choose to spend it." That freedom, small and enormous all at once, became the quiet foundation upon which Elena began, slowly and deliberately, to build something resembling an actual life of her own choosing. Autumn had fully settled over Ashwood by the time Elena felt ready to consider what came next for her life, the forest around the territory turning gold and amber in a slow, steady transformation that mirrored something shifting quietly within her as well. Dorian's official business in the territory had long since concluded, though he had extended his stay through careful diplomatic explanations that satisfied Elder Simon and the Pack Council without revealing the truer, more personal reason behind the delay. They sat together one crisp morning near the same overlook where they had first spoken of loneliness and isolation weeks earlier, the distant hills now painted in the deep colors of the changing season. Elena had grown comfortable in his presence, in a way that still occasionally surprised her, the careful vigilance she had maintained around nearly everyone in her life for 6 years finally, gradually easing whenever she found herself beside him. "I received word from my council yesterday," Dorian said, breaking a comfortable silence between them. "Matters in the Northern Territory require my attention. I can delay no longer without raising questions I'd rather not need to answer. Elena felt something tighten in her chest at the words, an anxiety she recognized now as fear of loss, rather than the old, familiar fear of danger. "When do you leave?" 3 days, Dorian said. "Sooner, if circumstances demand it." He turned to face her fully, his expression carrying a careful vulnerability she had rarely seen from him. "I've spent considerable time these past weeks, thinking about what I want to ask you, Elena, and I find myself, despite considerable practice at difficult conversations, uncertain how best to say it." "You could simply say it plainly," Elena offered, a small smile touching her lips, despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "I've noticed that tends to work well for you." Something like a laugh escaped him, brief and genuine. "Fair enough." He took a breath, steadying himself in a way that struck her as unexpectedly endearing, from someone who commanded an entire territory with practiced authority. "I would like you to come north with me, Elena, not merely as a guest, though I understand if that is the pace you need to begin with. I am asking, eventually, if you would consider building a life alongside me, as something considerably more than that." Elena's heart pounded, a mixture of joy and lingering uncertainty that she recognized as entirely reasonable given everything she had survived. "Dorian, She paused, gathering her thoughts carefully. "I care for you. Deeply, more than I expected to allow myself to care for anyone again after everything with Marcus. But I need you to understand something important first." "Tell me," Dorian said, his attention fully hers, patient as always. "I spent 6 years defined entirely by what someone else wanted from me," Elena said. "I need to know who I am outside of that, before I can properly know who I might become alongside someone else. I don't want to trade one kind of dependence for another, even one built on genuine affection rather than control." Dorian nodded slowly, something like admiration moving across his expression. "That's wise," he said. "Wiser, I think, than most people your age would manage after everything you've endured. I don't want you to feel pressured into anything, Elena, least of all a decision made from fear of losing something good rather than genuine readiness." "What are you suggesting then?" Elena asked. "Come north when you're ready," Dorian said. "Not immediately, not because I've asked, but when you've had time to build the foundation you're describing, your healing studies, your own sense of who you are and what you want, entirely separate from any relationship, mine included. I will wait, Elena, however long that requires." The offer settled warmly in Elena's chest, a patience that felt entirely different from anything she had experienced with Marcus, built on genuine respect rather than control disguised as care. "You would really wait?" she asked. "I've waited this long already," Dorian said, "for something I didn't fully understand I was waiting for, until I arrived in Ashwood, on what I believed was a routine border negotiation. A few more months, whatever time you need, feels a small price for something I suspect will prove worth considerably more patience than that." Elena felt tears gather, unfamiliar, but no longer frightening in the way they had once been. "I would like that," she said. "Time, first, and then, perhaps, everything else you're offering." "Then that's what we'll have," Dorian said simply, and the quiet certainty in his voice settled something deep and steady within her. In the days that followed, as Dorian's departure drew closer, Elena found herself spending increasing time with Nora, formalizing the healing studies she had begun weeks earlier into something resembling a genuine apprenticeship. The old healer welcomed the arrangement warmly, recognizing in Elena's careful, dedicated attention to the work, something that had clearly been suppressed for far too long. "You have good hands for this," Nora told her one afternoon, watching Elena carefully measure and combine herbs according to instructions she had already begun to memorize. "Steady, patient, it's a rare combination, especially in someone your age." "I had a lot of practice being patient," Elena said, a wry note entering her voice that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier, when even small jokes about her circumstances had felt too dangerous to risk. Nora smiled, recognizing the small, hard-won humor for what it was. "Patience born from survival can become patience useful for other things, given time," she said. "I think you'll make an excellent healer, Elena. The pack will be fortunate to have you, whenever you're ready to fully commit to the path." The morning of Dorian's departure arrived with a soft, gray mist settling over Ashwood, the kind of quiet, contemplative weather that seemed to suit the bittersweet nature of the farewell awaiting them. Elena walked with him to the edge of the territory, where his small convoy waited to carry him north, back toward the responsibilities and duties that had brought him to Ashwood in the first place. "Write to me," Dorian said, as they stood together near the carriage that would carry him away. "Tell me about your studies, about Nora's lessons, about whatever small victories and difficulties fill your days. I want to remain part of your life, even from a distance, while you build the foundation you need." "I will," Elena promised. "Every week, if you'll have patience for that many letters." "I would welcome nothing less," Dorian said, and something warm and certain passed between them, a promise neither needed to voice aloud to fully understand. He reached out, gently, and Elena allowed herself the small comfort of his hand against her cheek, a touch entirely different from anything she had experienced in 6 years of careful avoidance, gentle and asking, rather than demanding. "Take whatever time you need, Elena," Dorian said quietly. "I will be here, whenever you're ready. That much, I promise you completely." "Thank you," Elena said, "for seeing me when no one else did, for being patient enough to wait for the truth, and patient enough now to wait for whatever comes next." Dorian smiled, something soft and genuine that Elena had come to treasure over the past several weeks. "Some things are worth waiting for," he said. "I've learned that lesson rather thoroughly this past month." He climbed into the waiting carriage, and Elena watched the small convoy depart from Ashwood, carrying north the man who had upended her entire understanding of what safety and genuine care might look like. She stood at the territory boundary long after the carriage had disappeared beyond the tree line, feeling the strange, hollow ache of missing someone already, balanced against the quiet, steady certainty that this was not truly an ending, only a pause before whatever came next, in a life she was finally, fully learning to claim as her own. The weeks following Dorian's departure settled into a new, unfamiliar rhythm, one built entirely around Elena's own choices rather than the careful navigation of someone else's demands. She threw herself into her studies with Nora, learning the careful science of herbal remedies, alongside the older, more intuitive traditions the healer had practiced for decades, finding in the work a satisfaction that felt entirely her own, unearned by anyone else's permission. Her letters to Dorian arrived weekly, exactly as promised, filled with small details of her growing life. The first remedy she successfully prepared without Nora's guidance. A difficult conversation with Oliver about the years she had kept him at careful distance. The strange, disorienting experience of choosing her own meals, her own schedule, her own small preferences, without first calculating whether they might displease someone else. His replies came just as regularly, filled with updates from his own territory, alongside careful, patient questions about her progress, never pushing for more than she offered, always making clear that his patience remained steady, regardless of how long her healing required. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Ashwood in a quiet, white stillness that Elena found unexpectedly peaceful. She spent much of the season deep in her studies, occasionally traveling with Nora to neighboring settlements to assist with more serious cases, gaining practical experience that steadily built her confidence in a skill she had once believed permanently out of reach. The pack itself continued its slow reckoning. With the years Marcus's reputation had shielded from scrutiny, Elder Simon initiated new procedures for the guardianship of orphaned pack members, requiring more regular check-ins and independent oversight that Elena, when consulted, helped design based on her own painful understanding of exactly where the previous system had failed. It was strange, satisfying work, transforming 6 years of careful survival into something that might protect other children from enduring the same isolated fear she had known. "You're doing important work," Nora told her one evening, as they sat together by the fire in the healer's cottage, reviewing notes from the day's cases. "Both the healing and the other matter, with the council. Marcus took 6 years from you. You're spending some of what's left making sure fewer children lose the same." "I think about that a lot," Elena admitted. "How different things might have been if someone had asked the right questions sooner. If the counselor had pushed past the easy explanation, or if any of the household staff had felt safe enough to speak up earlier." "Reputation is a powerful shield," Nora said. "It protects the wrong people far too often, precisely because questioning it feels so socially costly. What you helped change, Elena, makes that shield considerably harder to hide behind. That matters more than you might fully appreciate yet." Oliver visited often throughout the winter months, their friendship deepening now that the careful walls Elena had once maintained had finally come down entirely. He had begun, with Elder Simon's encouragement, training for a more senior role among the pack's enforcers, and Elena found genuine pleasure in watching him grow into confidence she suspected had always been present beneath his easygoing manner, simply waiting for the right circumstances to fully emerge. "Do you think you'll go north eventually?" he asked her one afternoon, as they walked together along paths now covered in fresh snow. Elena considered the question, turning it over with the same careful thoughtfulness she brought to most decisions these days. "I think so," she said. "Not yet. I have more to learn here first, more of myself to understand, before I'm ready to build a life alongside someone else's, even someone I care for, as much as I've come to care for him." "That seems wise," Oliver said. "For what it's worth, I think he understands that better than most people would." "He does," Elena agreed, a small smile touching her lips at the thought of Dorian's steady, unwavering patience, present in every letter despite the physical distance between them. "I've been fortunate in that regard." As spring began to soften the last remnants of winter's snow, Elena found herself standing at the same overlook where Dorian had first asked her to consider a future alongside him, reflecting on how thoroughly her life had transformed in the months since his departure. She realized with a quiet, steady satisfaction, no longer the careful, guarded young woman who had spent 6 years disappearing into the background of her own existence. She had built something of her own now, skills, relationships, a sense of purpose that belonged entirely to her, unearned by anyone else's permission. She thought of her mother often during these quiet moments of reflection, wondering what Grace would have made of the woman Elena had slowly become since that terrible morning 6 years earlier when everything had changed. She liked to think her mother would have been proud, not simply of the survival, but of the deliberate, careful work of rebuilding that had followed it. It was during one such quiet morning, standing at the familiar overlook with the first true warmth of spring settling over the forest, that Elena finally allowed herself to fully acknowledge what she had known, quietly, for weeks, that she was ready, at last, for whatever came next. She wrote to Dorian that same afternoon, a letter shorter than her usual weekly correspondence, containing a single simple request that she hoped would carry the full weight of everything she had come to understand about herself and what she now wanted from her life. "I'm ready," she wrote. "Whenever you're able to come, I would like to see you again." Dorian arrived at Ashwood 2 weeks later, the journey undertaken personally rather than through any formal diplomatic channel, a choice that spoke, Elena understood immediately upon seeing him, of exactly how seriously he had taken her simple letter. She met him at the same territory boundary where they had said their farewell months earlier, the forest around them, now fully alive with the green abundance of late spring, rather than the quiet gray mist of that earlier morning. He looked, she thought, exactly as she remembered, and yet somehow different too. Or perhaps it was simply that she was seeing him now, through eyes that had spent months growing steadier, more certain of themselves. "You came quickly," she said, a smile she no longer had to carefully manage spreading easily across her face. "You said you were ready," Dorian said, closing the distance between them. "I saw no reason to delay finding out exactly what that meant." Elena laughed, a light, unguarded sound that would have been unthinkable in the careful, contained life she had lived before his first arrival in Ashwood, nearly a year earlier. "It means," she said, "that I've spent the past several months building something I'm proud of. Skills, relationships, an understanding of who I am when no one else is deciding that for me. And it means I think I'm ready now to build something new, alongside you, without losing any of what I've found here." "That sounds," Dorian said, something warm and steady in his expression, "exactly like the answer I was hoping for." They spent the following days together in Ashwood, walking familiar paths that now carried entirely different memories than the fear and careful navigation that had once defined them. Elena introduced Dorian properly to Nora, who studied him with the same sharp, assessing gaze she brought to everything, before finally offering a small, approving nod that Elena understood carried considerable weight from a woman who rarely extended trust easily. "She'll continue her studies," Nora told Dorian firmly, in a tone that left little room for argument. "Wherever she chooses to live, whatever life she builds alongside you, her healing work matters. I expect you to support that, not simply tolerate it." I intend to do considerably more than tolerate it, Dorian said, with a warmth that seemed to satisfy even Nora's careful scrutiny. The Northern Territory could use a skilled healer's knowledge. I would welcome whatever contribution Elena wishes to make there, in whatever form that takes. Oliver, too, met Dorian properly for the first time, the easy friendship between Elena and her oldest friend settling comfortably alongside the deeper bond she had built with the visiting king. Take care of her, Oliver said simply, when the two men shook hands. Though I suspect, from everything I've seen, you already understand exactly how to do that. I intend to spend considerable effort, making sure I always do, Dorian replied, and Elena, watching the exchange, felt something settle fully and completely into place within her chest. They spoke, during those final days in Ashwood, of practical matters as much as anything else, how Elena's healing studies might continue in the Northern Territory, how frequently she might return to Ashwood to maintain the friendships and connections that had helped rebuild her over the past months, what shape their life together might take once she officially made the journey north. It was, Elena reflected during these conversations, an entirely different kind of planning than anything she had experienced with Marcus, built on genuine partnership rather than one-sided demand, on mutual consideration rather than careful survival. Elder Simon hosted a small gathering before her departure, a modest celebration that Elena had once believed she would never merit, surrounded by pack members who had, over the preceding months, watched her transformation from careful, guarded silence into someone capable of laughter, of genuine connection, of claiming space in her own life without apology. You've given this pack an important gift, Elder Simon told her privately, during a quiet moment away from the gathering's warmth, not simply by exposing what Marcus did, though that matters enormously. You've shown us, through your own healing, what genuine recovery looks like. I hope you'll remember Ashwood fondly, wherever your life takes you next. I will, Elena promised. This will always be part of who I am, even as I build something new elsewhere. The morning of her departure arrived clear and bright, the forest around Ashwood fully alive with the promise of summer approaching. Elena stood at the same territory boundary where so many important moments of the past year had unfolded, looking back one final time at the territory that had shaped both the worst and, ultimately, the most transformative years of her life. She thought of the frightened girl who had once flinched at footsteps in a hallway, who had trained herself so thoroughly in careful blankness that she had nearly forgotten any other way to exist. She thought of the 6 years spent believing no one would ever look closely enough to see the truth, and of the stranger who had arrived on what everyone assumed was routine diplomatic business, and had instead changed the entire trajectory of her life through nothing more complicated than patient, genuine attention. Ready? Dorian asked, standing beside the waiting carriage, his hand extended toward hers. Elena looked at him, at the life stretching ahead of them, uncertain in the way all genuine futures remained uncertain, but built now on a foundation of trust and self-knowledge she had fought hard to reclaim. She took his hand, feeling the warmth and steadiness of it, so different from the careful fear that had once governed every touch in her life. Ready, she said, and meant it completely. The carriage carried them north, away from Ashwood, and the 6 difficult years that had shaped her, toward a future Elena had once believed impossible for someone like her to claim. She did not look back with regret as the territory disappeared behind them, only with the quiet, steady gratitude of someone who understood exactly how much had been overcome to reach this particular morning, this particular hope, this particular beginning. Behind her lay 6 years of silence, of careful survival dressed up as ordinary life, of a fear so constant it had nearly convinced her it was simply who she was. Ahead lay something she had once stopped allowing herself to imagine, a life built on genuine safety, on partnership rather than control, on the simple, radical truth that she had always deserved to be seen, to be believed, to be protected by someone who chose to look closely enough to notice what others had spent years overlooking. Elena settled into the carriage beside Dorian, watching the forest give way to open road, and allowed herself, fully and without reservation, to hope for everything that still lay ahead.